You open your eyes. The first thing you notice is that your blanket is gone. In fact, your entire bed is gone. No mattress, no pillow, no phone by your side. Instead, there's snow, lots of it. It's in your hair, in your ears, and if you try opening your mouth too wide, you'll probably inhale enough of it to qualify as the day's hydration. Congratulations, you've been upgraded to nature's walk-in freezer. Sadly, you're the meat. Welcome to the Ice Age. If you were hoping for a refreshing winter wonderland, you're out of luck. This isn't cozy sweater weather or sipping hot cocoa while the snow falls gently outside your window. This is your nose hairs freeze into tiny icicles when you breathe kind of weather. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was relentlessly, unforgivingly cold. Average global temperatures were about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius lower than today. But when you factor in the endless wind chill and the lack of central heating, it feels a lot more like living inside your freezer with the door permanently closed. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, what if you woke up in the Ice Age, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now, here's the kicker. This wasn't just a long winter. The last Ice Age, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, lasted tens of thousands of years. That's right, people didn't just wait it out until spring arrived. Spring was basically a myth. Instead, glaciers covered roughly a third of the Earth's landmass. Imagine walls of ice so tall they made skyscrapers look like Lego pieces, stretching for miles across continents. In North America, for example, the Laurentide ice sheet was up to 2 miles thick. That's enough ice to make your local skating rink cry from jealousy. So where exactly are you standing right now? That depends. If you woke up in what is today Canada, congratulations, you're currently standing inside a glacier. You'll want to move south immediately, unless being crushed by a few trillion tons of ice is your idea of a fun Tuesday. Much of Europe was buried too, with glaciers stretching over Scandinavia, Germany, and the British Isles. Only the lucky edges of the world, places like Africa, Southern Asia, and parts of South America, escaped total encasement. Even there, though, it wasn't exactly balmy. Think chilly desert nights rather than poolside vacation. But the real fun of waking up in the Ice Age isn't just the cold, it's how the cold reshapes everything. For starters, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters because so much of the Earth's water was trapped in glaciers. If you've ever dreamed about walking from Siberia to Alaska, this was your big chance. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America, which meant humans could spread across continents without worrying about boats. Of course, that sounds adventurous until you realize you'll be hiking across a windswept tundra with nothing but frostbite to keep you company. And speaking of tundra, let's talk landscapes. Forget your lush green forests or golden wheat fields. The Ice Age world was dominated by permafrost, endless plains of frozen soil, and sparse vegetation. Trees were scarce, grasses were stubborn survivors, and flowers were about as common as Wi-Fi. The environment was basically telling you, good luck surviving, don't expect me to help. Now here's where it gets interesting. Humans did survive this. Our ancestors weren't waking up in heated cabins with coffee makers. They were out there, facing this endless cold with nothing but fire, ingenuity, and whatever furs they could scrape together. Populations were smaller and survival required constant adaptation. If you were weak, sick, or simply unlucky, the Ice Age didn't politely excuse you, it erased you. But don't get too discouraged. Humans are annoyingly persistent. Despite the glacial chill, they developed strategies to endure. Migrating south in search of warmer climates was common, but those who stayed learned to live in the cold. They studied animal migrations, tracked seasons such as they were, and learned to use the land bridges and frozen rivers as highways to new territories. In short, while you're currently shivering and wondering if you can use snow as a blanket, the people of the Ice Age had already figured out how to make it work. And here's the thing, The Ice Age wasn't just one long stretch of endless freezing. It had cycles of warming and cooling, known as glacial and interglacial periods. Right now, in 2025, we're technically living in an interglacial period, the Holocene. That means we're in a warm pause between the icy blasts. If you think today's summers are too hot, just remember, the alternative is waking up in a world where you have to wrestle with frostbite before breakfast. So take a deep breath. Well, maybe not too deep unless you want your lungs to crystallize, and look around. You're not in your cozy bedroom anymore. The Ice Age doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care about your morning routine, your streaming service, or your grocery store. All it cares about is testing whether you're tough enough to last longer than a snowflake on a warm day. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? The cold plans to change that very, very soon. So you've woken up in the Ice Age. The good news? You're not alone. The bad news? Everything around you has sharper teeth, bigger muscles, and a greater interest in protein. And you happen to be the protein. Welcome to the neighborhood, where every resident is either looking to trample you, claw you, or nibble on you like an experimental snack. Let's start with the celebrities of the Ice Age, the saber-toothed cats. Forget your house cat that brings you half-dead mice as gifts. Smilodon could bring you half-dead people. These predators were about the size of a modern lion, but with absurdly long curved canine teeth up to 7 inches long. Imagine steak knives sticking out of a cat's mouth and you've got the picture. Saber-tooths weren't fast sprinters like cheetahs. Instead, they were ambush hunters. They would crouch in the tall grasses, wait for something unlucky to wander past, then leap out with enough force to make you seriously regret taking a morning stroll. If you thought modern cats judged you harshly, these guys judged you and then ate you. And just when you think, okay, I'll avoid the cats, you realize the dogs are no safer. Meet the dire wolf. Yes, Game of Thrones didn't make them up. These wolves were bulkier, heavier, and far more terrifying than their modern relatives. They hunted in packs, meaning if you saw one, you were really seeing 20. Imagine trying to fend off a dozen wolves with nothing but your bare hands, or more likely your bare screams. Dire wolves weren't picky. Bison, horses, humans. If it had meat, it was on the menu. And when one dire wolf sank its teeth into you, its packmates would happily turn dinner into an all-you-can-eat buffet. But surely, you think, not all Ice Age neighbors were out to eat me. Some were gentle giants, right? Technically, yes. Enter the woolly mammoth. Standing up to 13 feet tall and weighing as much as 6 tons, they were covered in shaggy fur and had enormous curved tusks that could stretch 15 feet long. Mammoths were mostly herbivores, munching on grasses and shrubs. But here's the problem. Herbivores don't need to eat you to kill you. They just need to get annoyed. Accidentally startle one, and you're likely to be stomped into the frozen tundra before you can even shout, "Nice trunk." Think of mammoths as the gigantic neighbors who mind their own business until you cross the property line. And then there were the giant ground sloths. Don't let the word sloth fool you. These creatures were anything but cuddly. Megatherium. The largest of them could reach over 20 feet in length when standing on its hind legs. Yes, 20 feet. That's taller than a giraffe, heavier than an elephant, and armed with claws sharp enough to shred through vegetation or you if you annoyed it. While technically plant eaters, these sloths were massive enough that if one swung a claw at you, you'd end up flatter than parchment. On the bright side, if you managed not to anger one, they probably wouldn't notice you at all. On the dark side, if they did notice you, you'd wish they hadn't. Of course, these weren't the only residents. There were short-faced bears, towering beasts that made modern grizzlies look like teddy bears. These bears could stand 12 feet tall and run faster than a racehorse. Imagine the most aggressive neighbor possible, one that breaks into your yard, outruns you, and then eats your lunch and you. Then there were American lions, larger than today's African lions, prowling in prides, and saber-toothed kangaroos in Australia. Yes, hopping nightmares with claws. The Ice Age was basically a live-action monster movie, and you were the underdog protagonist without any weapons or plot armor. But let's flip the perspective. Not every neighbor was a predator. Some were prey, though prey in the Ice Age still meant dangerous. Bison. Wild horses, reindeer, and musk oxen all roamed the tundras in vast herds. Hunting them provided food, fur, and bones for tools. But actually taking one down was a Herculean task. Without spears or teamwork, the only thing you'd succeed in doing is getting trampled. Think about it. You, one human, against 1,000-pound bison. The odds aren't in your favor. This predator-prey balance was the rhythm of Ice Age life. Every step you took could attract the attention of something bigger, meaner, or hungrier. Every noise could mean a pack of wolves circling in the distance. Survival wasn't about finding peace with nature. It was about making sure nature didn't notice you. Yet there's a strange beauty in it. Imagine looking out across the frozen plains and seeing herds of mammoths trudging in the distance, saber-tooths lurking at the edges, and flocks of giant birds overhead. It's a world where everything is supersized, exaggerated, and slightly unhinged, as if evolution had gone on a caffeine binge and started doodling monsters. So if you've woken up in the Ice Age, take comfort in this. You'll never be bored. On the bright side, you'll never be alone. On the dark side, everything wants to eat you. Morning in the Ice Age is not exactly cheery. There's no cereal box waiting for you. No hot toast, no coffee machine humming in the corner. In fact, there's no breakfast at all, unless you're willing to chase it, dig for it, or accidentally get mauled by it. In our world today, I skipped breakfast means you were too lazy to pour milk into a bowl. In the Ice Age, skipping breakfast was less of a choice and more of a daily reality because your breakfast was actively trying to avoid becoming your breakfast. The first thing to understand about Ice Age dining is that calories weren't just nice to have, they were life itself. When the world is frozen and the wind feels like it's biting straight through your bones, your body burns energy just trying to stay alive. You need fat, you need protein, you need enough calories to power a small car just to stagger through the day. Modern nutritionists talk about balanced diets. Ice Age nutritionists, if such a job existed, would have said, eat whatever you can grab before it kills you. So what's on the Ice Age menu? The star dish was meat, lots of it. Mammoth steaks weren't exactly an everyday option, but when a tribe did manage to bring one down, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. One mammoth could feed dozens of people for weeks, providing not just meat but fat, essential for surviving the cold, bones for tools, and hides for shelter. Hunting something that size, of course, came with the slight drawback that the mammoth could crush you into a pancake before you so much as sharpened your spear. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it just mauls you before you can cook it. More realistic daily meals came from smaller animals. Reindeer, musk oxen, wild horses, and even hares could end up on the plate. Fish were a crucial resource too. Streams and rivers provided a steady supply, and fish had the double benefit of being less likely to trample you mid-hunt. People learned to set traps, use bone hooks and spearfish in icy waters. Yes, it meant standing in freezing rivers, but when the alternative was starving, a little hypothermia felt like a fair trade. Gathering was just as important as hunting, though. Contrary to the popular caveman hunter stereotype, a huge portion of the Ice Age diet came from plants, roots, berries, nuts, and seeds. The trick was actually finding them in a landscape that looked like it had been carpet-bombed by winter. People became experts at spotting edible roots beneath the permafrost, or remembering where berry bushes would sprout in warmer months. Of course, edible is a relative term. Some plants nourished you, others poisoned you. Trial and error was basically the menu tester of the era. Eat the wrong berry, and congratulations, you just invented the Ice Age version of fast food. Fast in, fast out. And let's not forget fat. Fat was gold. In fact, archaeologists think Ice Age humans went out of their way to hunt fat-rich animals like mammoths, seals, and reindeer because fat burned slowly in the body, keeping people warm longer. Without it, survival was dicey. Picture yourself gnawing on a lean rabbit. Sure, it fills your stomach, but it won't keep you alive in sub-zero nights. Too much lean meat without fat can actually cause rabbit starvation, where your body shuts down because it's burning energy to digest protein without enough fat to sustain you. Translation: Eating nothing but bunny meat will literally kill you, which is perhaps the worst diet plan in history. Cooking was another survival trick. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was dinner prep. Raw meat was hard to digest, and raw fish carried parasites that made your insides feel like a science experiment gone wrong. With fire, food became safer, tastier, and easier to chew. Imagine a clan gathered around a fire, gnawing on chunks of roasted mammoth, while you sit there wishing someone would pass the salt. Seasonings weren't really a thing. If you wanted flavor, you were fresh out of luck, unless you count the faint aftertaste of smoke and desperation. But food wasn't guaranteed. That's the most important thing to understand about Ice Age breakfasts. Sometimes there wasn't one. Famine was a constant threat. A bad hunt, a failed fishing trip, or a harsh winter could leave entire groups starving. People had to be resourceful, storing dried meat, preserving fat, and even cracking open bones to slurp out marrow. Waste nothing, that was the rule. If a modern picky eater had been transported back, they wouldn't have lasted a week. Imagine turning up your nose at mammoth stew because it looked weird. Your Ice Age tribe would have laughed you straight into starvation. The rhythm of daily life was tied to food. Every step, every choice, every risk revolved around whether or not you'd manage to eat. Hunting wasn't heroic, it was necessary. Gathering wasn't casual, it was survival. And every time you put something in your mouth, you were gambling with your life. Will this nourish me, or will this berry introduce me to new and exciting ways to die? So if you woke up in the Ice Age and asked what's for breakfast, the answer would probably be whatever you can catch before it catches you. And if you're lucky, it'll be mammoth stew. If you're unlucky, it'll be the last thing you ever taste. If you woke up in the Ice Age without clothes, congratulations. You just invented a brand new survival game show called No Clothes and Afraid Ice Age Edition. Spoiler, you won't last long. The cold won't politely wait while you shop around for something cozy. You either get covered up, or you turn into a human popsicle faster than you can say woolly mammoth. In modern times, fashion is about trends. In the Ice Age, fashion was about not freezing to death. Forget about looking good for Instagram. Your outfit was supposed to keep you alive while trudging across frozen tundras. And the hottest trend, ironically, was fur. Not faux fur, not stylish fur-lined boots, but actual animal skins, stripped, tanned and sewn together to wrap around your shivering body. High fashion was wearing mammoth hide because if you didn't, you'd become mammoth food. The earliest clothing wasn't exactly elegant. Imagine taking the shaggy hide of a reindeer, draping it over your shoulders and calling it a day. Early humans probably started with this sort of drapery, tying furs together with sinew or plant fibers. Functional, yes. Flattering, only if you're into the giant hairy burrito look. But necessity drives innovation, and before long, Ice Age people got inventive. Archaeologists have found evidence of bone needles dating back at least 30,000 years. Yes, needles, tiny, carved from bone or ivory, with holes drilled for thread. This wasn't random tinkering, this was the dawn of tailoring. Instead of walking around with hides awkwardly wrapped around them, people could stitch pieces together, shaping clothes that actually fit. Sewn garments trapped heat better, allowed freer movement, and most importantly, gave you a fighting chance at staying alive. A neatly sewn fur coat could mean the difference between surviving the night or becoming tomorrow morning's frozen cautionary tale. Thread came from sinew, animal tendons, plant fibers, or even gut. If you're squeamish about sewing with intestines, too bad. You weren't exactly popping down to the craft store for yarn. These threads were surprisingly strong, and combined with bone needles, they allowed for clothing that could endure harsh use. Think parkas, leggings, boots and mittens, all handmade, all vital. Your modern polyester hoodie would last about 5 minutes in Ice Age winds. And clothing wasn't just about warmth, it was also about adaptability. Boots were crafted from reindeer or mammoth hide, insulated with fur to keep feet from freezing solid. Hoods shielded faces from windburn. Gloves, rudimentary but effective, kept fingers intact, because once frostbite set in, you'd lose more than just style points. Dressing in layers wasn't invented by your outdoorsy uncle. It was an Ice Age standard. People knew that multiple furs and hides worked better than one giant slab of mammoth skin. Clothing also became a marker of culture. Different groups developed unique styles depending on the animals they hunted and the resources available. In colder regions, outfits were bulkier and heavily layered. In slightly milder zones, clothes were lighter but still protective. Some garments even had decorative elements, beads, shells, or dyed fibers, suggesting that even in a world where survival was a full-time job, humans couldn't resist adding a little flair. After all, if you're going to spend your life trudging through snowdrifts, you might as well look halfway decent doing it. What's remarkable is how much thought went into these garments. For example, seams were often stitched on the outside, preventing cold air from sneaking in. Hoods were designed to keep body heat from escaping. Boots were waterproofed with animal fat. These weren't crude rags. They were functional, tested, and refined over generations. The Ice Age was the birthplace of practical fashion engineering. Paris runways may strut furs for style, but Ice Age humans were strutting them for survival. And let's not forget accessories. Belts made of hide helped secure clothes. Rope and straps tied boots. People even used animal bones as fasteners, essentially inventing buttons long before Zara decided to mass-produce them. Some groups wore necklaces of teeth and claws, not just to look intimidating, but possibly to mark skill, status, or spiritual beliefs. Imagine wearing a saber-toothed tooth around your neck. Today that's a flex. Back then it was a survival resume. Yes, I wrestled with this cat. No, it didn't end well for the cat. Of course, not everyone got a full wardrobe. Making clothes took time, skill, and materials. That meant every piece of hide, every scrap of fur had to count. Children wore downsized versions of adult clothes, patched together as they grew. Garments were repaired again and again until they practically became frankencoats of stitched patches. When something wore out beyond repair, the material was reused. Fur for insulation, leather for straps, sinew for sewing. Waste was not an option. So what would you wear if you woke up in the Ice Age? Ideally, something from the survival chic collection. A layered parka of reindeer fur, mammoth hide boots lined with hair pelts, gloves stitched from fox skins, and a hood that made you look like an oversized snow goblin. It's not glamorous, but it beats frostbite. Forget your designer things. Your new designer label is whatever didn't kill me yesterday. In short, Ice Age fashion wasn't about walking the runway. It was about walking anywhere at all without freezing solid. Without clothes, you'd be dead in hours. With clothes, you had a fighting chance. They weren't pretty, they weren't social media worthy, but they worked. And in the Ice Age, working was the only thing that mattered. So you've managed not to freeze solid in your first night of the Ice Age. And congratulations, your caveman Airbnb host has just handed you the keys to your new home. Unfortunately, your choices are slim. Option 1, a cave. Option 2, a hut made of mammoth bones. Option 3, a hastily stacked ice shelter. And option 4, squatting in the open tundra, which is less of a home and more of a pre-death waiting area. Let's explore your prehistoric real estate market. Spoiler, Zillow hasn't gotten here yet, but if it did, the listings would all read drafty, dark, possibly haunted by bears, no running water, $0 a month, but at what cost? Caves were the Ice Age version of prime property. Solid walls, natural insulation, and the occasional dramatic wall art by your prehistoric neighbors. It's the closest thing to cozy you're going to find. But before you settle in, you'll need to check for the fine print. Namely the fact that caves already have tenants. Bears loved caves, lions loved caves, sometimes hyenas loved caves, and none of them are going to appreciate you barging in and saying, "Hi, I'm your new roommate." In fact, the archaeological record shows evidence of caves being alternately used by humans and large predators, which means survival often depended on timing. Move in too early, and you risk a lion's security deposit being your leg. Move in too late, and the place smells like hyena leftovers. And even if you get a cave all to yourself, it's not exactly luxury living. Caves are dark, damp, and echo in ways that make you wonder if someone or something is moving deeper inside. On the upside, it's easy to hang your furs on a rock and call it caveman chic. On the downside, there's no fireplace unless you make one, which brings us to, if the cave was your home, fire was your HVAC system, and unlike your modern thermostat, fire came with a set it and pray it works feature. Early humans had to master the art of making sparks from flint or rubbing sticks together for what must have felt like decades. Imagine needing warmth, protection and light, and the only thing standing between you and frostbite is your ability to smack two rocks together until something catches. But once fire was burning, life changed. A hearth inside a cave or hut was a social hub, a defense mechanism, and a survival tool rolled into one. Fire kept predators away, cooked your food so it was less likely to kill you with bacteria, and provided a much-needed psychological boost against the never-ending dark of Ice Age winters. It also smoked up the cave like a barbecue gone wrong. Don't picture cozy fireplaces. Picture coughing in a dark stone hole while your eyes water and you hope the mammoth ribs don't fall off the spit. Funny enough, archaeologists believe that some groups even constructed special hearths with stone rings to contain the flames. A prehistoric version of a campfire pit you'd see at summer camp, only with higher stakes. Miss the marshmallows and you still had to roast your roots and rabbit meat somehow. When caves weren't available or were already claimed by things with bigger teeth, Ice Age humans built their own homes, and they didn't skimp on materials. In places like Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered entire huts built from mammoth bones. Think about that for a second. Today we brag about granite countertops. Back then people bragged about walls made from femurs. These bone huts weren't small either. Some structures stretched over 30 feet wide, with carefully arranged tusks forming the framework and hides stretched over the top for insulation. Talk about heavy-duty housing. Mammoth bones are basically concrete with tusks attached. Building one of these wasn't easy. You'd need a group effort, hunting success, and a lot of creativity. But if you pulled it off, you had a fortress against the cold that could outlast seasons. Of course, it also meant you were essentially living inside the skeleton of your dinner. Romantic? Maybe not. Practical? Absolutely. Let's say you didn't have a cave and you didn't have a mammoth carcass. What then? Well, necessity breeds invention, and humans occasionally built quick shelters out of snow and ice. Temporary igloo-like structures that kept wind off and heat in. They weren't permanent, and you wouldn't want to stay long, but they worked in emergencies. Other quick shelters included lean-tos made of branches, brush and hides. Not great insulation, but better than nothing. Think of them as the Ice Age equivalent of a cardboard box in a rainstorm, cheap, easy, and barely holding together. Homes weren't just about survival. They were about community. Sharing a fire in a cave or bone hut meant storytelling, teaching, planning hunts, and passing down knowledge. If you're imagining everyone huddled in silence, think again. Archaeological evidence suggests communal life revolved around hearths. In a way, your shelter wasn't just protecting you from the cold, it was building the roots of culture. So what's your Ice Age housing situation? Your real estate agent hands you 3 listings: cave, drafty, possibly lion-infested, mammoth bone hut, smells like dead mammoth but sturdy, or ice shelter, may collapse if you sneeze too hard. Either way, it beats sleeping out in the snow, because in the Ice Age, homeless was just another word for next on the food chain. So you've made it through the night without freezing solid, avoided being a saber-tooth snack, and even managed to choke down some roasted roots or mammoth stew. Congratulations, you're alive, but don't celebrate too soon, because the Ice Age had a knack for finding creative ways to break, bruise, cut, and maul you. Healthcare in this era wasn't so much healthcare as it was, well, let's see if you survive the night. If you've ever complained about waiting an hour in a doctor's office, imagine your Ice Age appointment. The doctor is a shaman chanting around a fire, your medicine is crushed leaves and moss, and your copay is probably a rabbit pelt. The first hurdle was simple survival from injuries. Hunting giant animals like mammoths or aurochs wasn't just dangerous, it was practically begging the Grim Reaper to send you an RFVP. Broken bones? That was basically a rite of passage, and while today you might expect a cast and an X-ray, in the Ice Age you were more likely to get a splint made from sticks, wrapped tightly with rawhide, and a pat on the back that essentially meant, good luck hobbling for the next 6 months. And if you're wondering about physical therapy, don't. Your recovery plan was either to keep moving with the tribe or risk getting left behind. Ice Age medicine was brutally efficient in that way. Cuts and infections were another cheerful part of daily life. A gash from a poorly sharpened stone tool or the tusk of an angry mammoth could mean more than just a scar. It could mean sepsis. Without antibiotics, infection spread faster than gossip at a village fire. The best you could hope for was the tribe's attempt at sterilization with smoke, hot stones, or bitter herbs that doubled as both medicine and torture. And here's the kicker. Sometimes it worked. Archaeologists have found bones showing evidence of healed injuries that would have been fatal without some kind of treatment. Which means, against all odds, prehistoric first aid wasn't just guesswork. It had its moments of real effectiveness. But let's talk about the showstopper of Ice Age medicine, trepanning. Imagine waking up with a headache, and your local healer decides the cure is to drill a hole in your skull with a piece of flint. That's right, brain surgery. Without anesthesia, antiseptic, or even so much as a pillow to bite down on. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls with neat round holes, and here's the wild part. Many show signs of bone healing, meaning the patients actually survived this medieval horror show thousands of years before the Middle Ages even existed. Why did they do it? Maybe to treat seizures, head trauma, or to let out evil spirits. Whatever the reason, you can't deny one thing. Ice Age humans had guts, or at least holes in their heads. Of course, not every cure involved bone drilling. Natural remedies played a huge role. Plants with medicinal properties were prized, even if people didn't exactly know why they worked. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the chemical ancestor of aspirin, and there's evidence it may have been used as a pain reliever. Pine resin and mosses had antiseptic qualities, which means sometimes when your shaman smeared sticky green goo on your wound, it wasn't just superstition, it was proto-science at work. And then there were the rituals, chants, dances, and smoke ceremonies that may not have healed your broken leg, but at least distracted you long enough to forget about it for 5 minutes. But let's not sugarcoat it. Medicine was rough, and the margin of error was enormous. Lose too much blood? That's it. Snake bite? Say goodbye. Childbirth? Extremely dangerous, with survival far from guaranteed for either mother or baby. Even something as simple as a toothache could escalate to life-threatening infection. And there was no dentistry unless you count yanking the tooth out with a rock and a lot of courage. If you think you're tough, imagine enduring all that without painkillers, because unless you passed out from sheer agony, you felt every second of it. And that brings us to the darkly funny reality. The closest thing Ice Age people had to anesthesia was fainting. Despite all this, Ice Age humans weren't hopeless. They adapted, learned, and shared knowledge across generations. The mere fact that their medical practices left behind evidence of healed injuries means they weren't fumbling in total darkness. They were experimenting, learning what herbs soothed pain, what techniques actually saved lives, and passing those discoveries along. In a world where every day was a health hazard, that knowledge was priceless. The fact that humans made it through the Ice Age at all is proof that, while crude, their medical systems worked often enough to keep the species alive. So, if you woke up in the Ice Age and scraped your knee, or more realistically, dislocated your shoulder fleeing a hungry dire wolf, don't expect a trip to urgent care. Expect fire, chanting, maybe a herbal paste, and a whole lot of gritting your teeth. Healthcare wasn't about comfort. It was about giving you just enough of a fighting chance to see tomorrow's sunrise. Pain was inevitable, but survival? That was the real prescription. If you think surviving the Ice Age was all about muscles, sharp spears, and thick mammoth coats, think again. The real secret weapon was teamwork. Humans discovered very quickly that going solo in a land filled with saber-toothed cats and winter temperatures that could freeze your eyebrows solid was basically nature's way of saying, you won't last till lunch. And so tribes were born. Small groups of families and extended kin who decided the best way to live another day was to work together, share resources, and occasionally argue over who ate the last scrap of dried reindeer meat. Life in a tribe wasn't just about safety in numbers. It was about pooling skills. Not everyone could bring down a mammoth, but maybe someone was really good at knapping flint into razor-sharp blades. Another person might have had the patience to weave sinew into thread for sewing, while someone else could recognize which berries wouldn't poison everyone. Everyone had a role, and while not all roles were glamorous, being the one assigned to scrape hides with a sharp rock doesn't sound thrilling. It was necessary. In this system, even the less athletic or the elderly had important places. The grandmother who couldn't run fast enough to chase a bison might still save the tribe by remembering where edible roots grew. Knowledge, not just strength, kept tribes alive. Of course, the real glue holding tribes together was storytelling. Imagine nights when the wind howled outside like a pack of wolves, and inside, around the fire, someone told tales of ancestors, gods or heroes who supposedly caught the biggest mammoth anyone had ever seen. These weren't just campfire bragging rights, they were lessons wrapped in entertainment. Stories taught young hunters about strategy, warned children about dangers, don't wander off at night, or the cave bear will get you, and gave everyone a sense of belonging. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was the first stage for humanity's earliest comedians, philosophers and drama queens. Now, was it all warm hugs and group bonding? Absolutely not. Living in close quarters with a dozen or so people had its challenges. Hygiene was a polite suggestion at best, so you were often stuck with someone whose personal scent could rival that of a wet dire wolf. Conflicts happened too. Food was scarce, tempers ran hot, and not everyone agreed on the best place to set up camp. The good news? Having people around boosted your survival chances. The bad news? Sometimes those same people were eyeing you the way you were eyeing the mammoth, purely in terms of calories. After all, when berries are gone and winter stretches on, things got desperate. Archaeologists have found bones with suspicious cut marks that suggest not every tribe member died of natural causes, but for the most part cooperation worked wonders. When it came to hunting, tribes developed group strategies. Imagine trying to outwit a woolly mammoth with just one spear. You'd end up flatter than your fur bedroll. But with 10 or 20 hunters working in coordination, driving herds into ravines, setting traps or encircling an animal, they could succeed. This wasn't random chaos. It was an early form of military strategy. The Ice Age may not have had generals with shiny medals, but it did have tribes that knew divide and conquer wasn't just a phrase, it was survival. Social bonds extended beyond the immediate tribe too. Groups sometimes exchanged members through marriage or alliances, which helped keep genetic diversity healthy because too much keeping it in the family leads to trouble fast. These networks meant sharing tools, trade items and knowledge across wider regions. You could almost say it was the Ice Age version of LinkedIn, except instead of sending a polite request to connect, you showed up with a spear and a basket of dried fish as an offering. Spiritual life also tied tribes together. Rituals, dances, and cave paintings weren't just fun ways to kill time. They were essential for group identity and cohesion. A painted bison on a cave wall wasn't only art. It might have been a way of saying, this is who we are, this is what we hunt, this is what keeps us alive. These shared practices gave everyone the sense that they were part of something bigger than just their small camp. And when survival is constantly on the line, believing in a collective purpose can make all the difference. So yes, the tribe was the original survival team, long before modern reality TV stole the concept. Only, instead of getting voted off the island, you might get left behind on the tundra. The lesson was clear. Stay useful, stay loyal, and keep the fire stories entertaining enough so people forget how much you snore. Your survival odds went up significantly with friends, but as always there was the lingering thought that one of those friends might one day decide you'd taste better than berries. If you woke up in the Ice Age, you'd quickly realize something. The phrase cutting edge was painfully literal. Forget smartphones, tablets, or even the humble can opener. Your survival depended on rocks. Not just any rocks, but the ones you could chip, flake, or bash into a sharp enough edge to stab, scrape, or slice. And trust me, when you're staring down a mammoth the size of a bus, a slightly pointier rock feels like the difference between life and a messy headline in prehistory's newspaper. Stone tools weren't just gadgets, they were passports to staying alive. The earliest Ice Age humans learned how to strike flint or chert against harder stones, breaking them into razor-sharp shards called flake tools. With these, they could butcher meat, scrape hides, carve wood, or make other tools. One wrong swing, though, and congratulations, you've just invented the world's first useless pebble. But when it worked, it worked. Those shards could slice through mammoth hide or fish scales with terrifying efficiency. A good toolkit meant you weren't going hungry or cold or naked. But stone was only the beginning. Humans got clever with attachments, creating the prehistoric Swiss Army knife, the spear. By attaching sharpened stone blades to wooden shafts with sinew or plant fibers, they could turn pointy stick into pointy stick with ambition. Some groups even developed throwing spears that worked with spear throwers atlatls, giving them more range and force. Imagine standing 30 feet away from a charging bison and thinking, yeah, I'll just lob this rock-tipped stick at it, that'll do. The astonishing part? It often did. Of course, hunting wasn't the only use for Ice Age tools. Scrapers helped prepare animal hides for clothing, which was just as crucial for survival. Awls, basically sharp, needle-like stones, were used to poke holes through hides, making way for bone needles and sinew thread. You might think sewing is boring, but in the Ice Age it was runway-level important. No stitched hides, no clothes, frostbite. Well, let's just say you wouldn't be worried about next season's fashion trends. And then there was fire. You may take your lighter for granted, but in the Ice Age, starting a fire was an Olympic-level sport. Early humans discovered that striking flint against iron pyrite could throw sparks onto dry tinder, igniting flames. It wasn't easy. One bad gust of wind and you were back to square one, shivering in the snow, cursing your technology. But once fire was tamed, it changed everything. Warmth, cooked food, light, and protection against predators. Fire was the prehistoric Wi-Fi. It brought people together and made life just bearable enough to keep going. Still, Ice Age technology wasn't all weapons and warmth. Humans had a spark of creativity too, literally on cave walls. Cave paintings in places like Lascaux and Chauvet weren't just doodles, they were early communication. Painted mammoths, bison and horses may have recorded hunts, served as teaching tools, or acted as early forms of ritual magic, like saying, "See that bison? Let's paint it first, then spear it in real life." The walls became storyboards, teaching lessons across generations long before anyone figured out alphabets. So while you scroll Instagram, just know Ice Age humans had their own galleries, less selfies, more mammoth appreciation posts. Bone and ivory also joined the tech lineup. Early humans carved harpoons, needles, and even ornaments from animal bones and tusks. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Decorating objects showed that humans were developing abstract thought. Imagine spending your freezing winter carving a necklace out of mammoth ivory. It might not help you spear a bison, but it made you part of a shared culture, a group identity. Even in the harshest conditions, humans wanted to make life not just survivable, but meaningful. So if you woke up in the Ice Age, your toolbox would look like this: a handful of sharp rocks, a fire-starting kit that only works when it feels like it, a spear that might save you or might bounce off a mammoth's hide, and some bone needles to keep your clothes in one piece. It doesn't sound glamorous, but for Ice Age humans it was cutting-edge innovation. And while you're fumbling with your rock-based starter kit, remember this: your smartphone has 12 cameras. Their technology, one rock, slightly sharper than another rock, and somehow they survived. You've survived the ice, dodged the saber tooth, and even managed to spear yourself some dinner. Congratulations, you are still breathing. Unfortunately, the Ice Age has one more trick up its frosty sleeve. Everything else is also trying to kill you. If the weather and predators didn't get you, the invisible world of disease, parasites, and random bad luck was always lurking in the background, waiting for you to trip, bleed, or scratch your way into an early grave. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Let's start with the most obvious killer, starvation. Food wasn't a guaranteed daily luxury. It was more like a high-stakes lottery. One week, your tribe might feast on mammoth steaks until everyone was stuffed. The next, you'd be gnawing on roots and pretending they tasted like roasted bison. Malnutrition was a slow, cruel death, and if you didn't get enough calories, your body simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive. It wasn't about diets or portion control. It was about whether your ribcage looked skeletal because of fashion choices or because you hadn't eaten in 3 days. But let's say you got lucky and managed to secure enough calories to keep the icicles off your nose. That didn't mean you were safe. Ice Age humans had to deal with the delightful company of parasites. Fleas, lice, and worms didn't just make life itchy, they spread disease. Imagine scratching your scalp raw in the middle of winter, only to discover you'd introduced an infection that made your head swell like a melon. Cleanliness was not exactly a cultural priority when your daily routine involved dirt, smoke, and mammoth guts, so parasites thrived in the warmth of your furs and bedding. You weren't just wearing hides, you were hosting a whole petting zoo of unwanted guests. Then there were the predators you might not have noticed. Everyone remembers the saber-toothed cats and dire wolves, but even small animals could be a danger. A wolf bite might not kill you immediately, but without antibiotics, the infection that followed almost certainly would. One wrong encounter with a boar or wild horse could shatter bones, and bones didn't always heal right. A broken leg might mean permanent disability, or worse, being left behind by the tribe because no one could carry you across the tundra. Social bonds were strong, but survival math was brutal. One person dragging another meant 2 potential deaths instead of 1. And if you think only nature was cruel, think again. Sometimes humans themselves were the problem. Tribal conflicts over hunting grounds or water sources could turn violent. A thrown spear didn't have to hit a mammoth. It could just as easily hit you. Interpersonal squabbles could escalate, and let's be honest, the Ice Age didn't have a robust legal system. If someone thought you stole their marrow-rich bones, well, you might find yourself at the wrong end of a sharp rock. Accidents, too, were everywhere. Slip on the ice, fall into a crevasse, or tumble into a river, and it was game over. Fire, humanity's greatest tool, was also one of its greatest hazards. Without fire safety lectures or smoke alarms, it was easy to burn yourself, your shelter, or your food supply. A single misstep could turn your carefully built mammoth bone hut into a very expensive bonfire. Disease was perhaps the most mysterious killer of all. The Ice Age didn't come with doctors or germ theory, but early humans definitely noticed that sometimes people just got sick and died. Viruses and bacteria, invisible to the naked eye, were devastating in communities that lived in close quarters. Childhood diseases we shrug off today. Measles, mumps, smallpox would have been catastrophic. High infant mortality was the tragic norm. A baby's chances of surviving past the first few years were depressingly low, which is why Ice Age tribes often had lots of children. Most would never live long enough to help chase a mammoth. And speaking of life expectancy, don't expect to blow out too many birthday candles. If you made it to 30, you were basically the village elder, a walking encyclopedia of survival tips, and probably hunched over from a lifetime of injuries and malnutrition. Teeth rotted out early, arthritis set in young, and the daily grind of survival wore bodies down fast. For every story of heroic hunts and clever tool-making, there were dozens of quiet deaths from infection, exposure, or just plain exhaustion. Yet somehow, through all this misery, humanity didn't just survive, it thrived. Maybe it was sheer stubbornness, maybe it was cooperation, or maybe it was the ability to laugh at the absurdity of life when fleas were making a meal out of your ankles. The resilience of Ice Age humans is astonishing when you consider the odds stacked against them. They lived in a world where death was always one step behind, and yet they kept moving forward, inventing, adapting, and eventually paving the way for civilizations far removed from caves and mammoth bones. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice that the Ice Age wasn't so much a picturesque winter wonderland as it was a relentless gauntlet of dangers. Surviving meant accepting that at any moment the world could decide you were expendable. And yet, against all logic, people made it through. Next, it might be time to pull back from the doom and gloom and ask the big question: how did these Ice Age survivors set the stage for the first sparks of culture? Because if you're going to get fleas, frostbite and fractured bones, you might as well paint something on the wall while you're at it. The Ice Age was never meant to last forever, and while that sounds comforting, the reality was a mix of chaos, climate shifts, and the kind of animal extinctions that left early humans standing around saying, "Well, now what do we eat?" The last great Ice Age gradually wound down about 10,000 years ago, as glaciers retreated, temperatures warmed, and the Earth began to look a little less like a frozen wasteland and more like the temperate zones we recognize today. But for people who had spent countless generations perfecting the art of mammoth hunting and fur sewing, this wasn't so much a relief as it was a total lifestyle crisis. Imagine devoting your entire survival plan to giant, furry, walking refrigerators, and then one day they're gone. Suddenly you're left trying to spear rabbits, which don't exactly feed the whole tribe. Climate change wasn't just about losing your favorite oversized dinner, it reshaped everything. Vast grasslands turned into forests, rivers changed course, coastlines shifted, and humans had to adapt all over again. This was the great turning point. With fewer giant animals to hunt and more unpredictable seasons, humans began to settle down, experiment with plants, and stumble into agriculture. Yes, the first farmers probably weren't enthusiastic about it. Growing wheat sounds sensible now, but at the time it meant bending over in the dirt for weeks only to end up with a handful of grain you still had to figure out how to cook. Hunting was dangerous, yes, but farming was boring. Still, necessity is the mother of invention, and without the end of the Ice Age, there would be no farms, no villages, and no eventual rise of cities. Civilization was built on the ashes, or rather the melting ice of that frozen world. For the creatures that had defined the Ice Age, though, there was no exit strategy. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, and other megafauna dwindled into extinction, some because of climate change, some because of hungry humans with sharp sticks and way too much free time. The planet's warming trend simply didn't favor massive, cold-adapted animals, and the unlucky ones couldn't evolve fast enough to survive. Humans, on the other hand, had brains, fire, and enough stubbornness to figure out how to make life work, whether that meant fishing, farming, or just moving somewhere warmer. Survival meant flexibility, and flexibility was humanity's true secret weapon. Looking back, you might think you'd want to visit the Ice Age, maybe get a selfie with a mammoth, or see a saber-tooth in the wild. But let's be honest, you wouldn't last long. Your modern immune system, fine-tuned to handle lattes and Wi-Fi signals, would collapse at the first parasite. Your shoes would disintegrate in the snow, your jacket wouldn't be half as warm as reindeer hide, and your breakfast options would consist of charred roots, questionable fish, or starvation. And let's not forget that everything you'd meet, from wolves to bears to the weather itself, would be actively trying to kill you. Reflection time. If you woke up tomorrow in the Ice Age, your odds of surviving a week would be laughably slim. Maybe you'd make it 3 days if you stuck with a tribe that pitied you. But sooner or later, the cold or hunger would win. And that's why staying in 2025 isn't so bad. Sure, we have traffic jams, taxes, endless spam emails, and that one neighbor who insists on mowing the lawn at 6 a.m. But our morning commutes don't involve outrunning a saber-toothed cat. Our healthcare doesn't involve drilling a hole in your skull without anesthesia. Our fashion may be questionable, but at least you don't need to skin a mammoth to stay alive. In the end, the Ice Age may have shaped us, but it's not a place you'd want to revisit. Humanity had its exit strategy, and so do you. Stay where you are, sip your coffee, and be grateful that the only ice you face today comes in cubes. floating politely in your drink. Let's get one thing straight. You're basically a walking, talking bag of salt water. Without salt, your body stops working faster than a medieval peasant at tax collection time. Sodium is what keeps your nerves firing, your muscles contracting, and your blood pressure from plummeting you face first into the dirt. Strip salt out of the equation and you'd be less human being and more sad, malfunctioning water balloon. Your cells would leak, your heart would falter, and your body would give up faster than a knight trying to joust without a horse. Salt is essential to life, but the strange thing is, unlike water, it doesn't exactly announce itself. You can't just look at a mountain and say, yep, that's drinkable sodium chloride. You need a reason to seek it, and humans, being the curious, stubborn creatures we are, figured it out long before there were labels, recipes, or wellness bloggers telling us to avoid excess sodium. So how did our ancestors stumble onto the magical rock that makes popcorn worth eating? Likely by watching animals. Herds of deer, bison, and elephants would flock to salt licks, natural deposits where minerals bubbled up from the ground. Early humans noticed, thought, hey, maybe that rock isn't just for licking cows, and tried it for themselves. Imagine being the first guy to take a nibble of a random white crystal on the ground. It could have been deadly poison, or it could have been deliciously savory. That one lick may have been humanity's first gourmet moment, the prehistoric equivalent of discovering chocolate cake. And let's be honest, salt is the only rock we've collectively decided to sprinkle on French fries instead of using to smash someone over the head. You don't see anyone seasoning their eggs with gravel, but salt? Salt gets a free pass. We've turned it into a kitchen essential, a preservative, even a metaphor, salt of the earth. All because some caveman dared to lick a rock and found it surprisingly tasty. But here's the thing, salt was never just about flavor. Long before TikTok chefs started telling you to finish your steak with a little flaky sea salt, people realized salt meant survival. Imagine trying to live without refrigeration, supermarkets, or Uber Eats. Food spoiled fast, meat rotted in days, and fish turned into an odor you could smell from the next valley. Salt changed all of that. It dried, cured, and preserved food so it could last months, even years. That meant security through harsh winters, long hunting trips, or those awkward times when crops failed and everyone was suddenly looking at the family goat a little too hungrily. The need for salt made it powerful. Whoever controlled salt sources controlled life itself. You could survive without spices, sugar, or even coffee, though you'd be grumpy, but you could not survive without salt. This wasn't optional seasoning. It was the foundation of civilization's pantry. When humans shifted from roaming hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, salt was part of the deal. Farming made surplus food, salt kept it edible, and suddenly you could feed more people. More people meant villages, villages meant cities, and cities meant some guy would eventually declare himself king and demand taxes in salt, of course. But that comes later. For now, picture early humanity's relationship with salt as a kind of rocky romance. At first it was a novelty, a fun taste found by accident while following some elk around. Then it became a necessity, a way to preserve meat, fish, and even vegetables. Before long it grew into a full-on obsession. People started scouring lake shores, evaporating seawater, and digging deep into the earth to find this glittering treasure. Entire communities popped up around salt deposits. If there was salt nearby, you didn't just have a snack, you had a future. Salt's role in culture only adds to its legend. It wasn't just food, it was protection, purity, and symbolism. Ancient people tossed it into fires during rituals, sprinkled it over fields to bless harvests, and used it in medicine long before aspirin was a thing. In their minds, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was a divine substance. After all, anything that could make rotten fish edible had to be a gift from the gods. So here's the paradox. Salt is so ordinary today that it's almost invisible. You can buy a giant container for pocket change, and no one ever starts a revolution over iodized versus sea salt. But for most of human history, salt was the stuff empires rose and fell on. It was wealth. It was war. It was worship. The story of salt is the story of how humanity learned to survive, thrive, and eventually build civilizations bigger than one hungry family around a campfire. This chapter is just the first pinch on the plate. Over the next sections, we'll see how salt carved roads across continents, sparked bloody wars, inspired revolts, and built fortunes. But it all started with one simple truth. Without salt, you're not living. You're just a leaky water balloon, wishing you'd licked the rock when you had the chance. If you wanted salt in the ancient world, you didn't stroll to the corner store and toss a shaker into your basket between bread and butter. No, getting salt was more like a death-defying expedition. You had to hack it out of mountains, scrape it from dried-up lakes, or boil gallons of seawater just to get a few handfuls of crystals. It was the world's first dangerous treasure hunt, minus the maps marked with an X. Let's start in Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. These folks weren't just good at inventing writing and accidentally flooding fields with irrigation. They also learned how to harvest salt. The Sumerians and Babylonians boiled salty water from marshes and riverbeds, then scraped off the precious residue. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was life-saving. Without salt, their early urban societies would have crumbled faster than a sandcastle in a thunderstorm, and because Mesopotamians were also medicine enthusiasts, they used salt in treatments. Got a wound? Rub salt in it. Literally. Painful? Absolutely. Effective at killing bacteria? Surprisingly, yes. It was their ancient version of "it stings, so it must be working." Meanwhile, in ancient China, salt was practically a national project. Archaeologists have uncovered salt works dating back to 6000 BCE in Sichuan, where clever early engineers drilled bamboo pipes deep into the ground to bring up brine. Yes, bamboo pipelines. Centuries before Romans built aqueducts, the Chinese were slurping salt water straight from the earth and turning it into survival seasoning. By the time of the Han Dynasty, salt wasn't just a useful mineral, it was the backbone of the state economy. Chinese rulers figured out early that salt meant control. Whoever owned the salt owned the people. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's a story for later chapters. For now, it's enough to say that in ancient China, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a serious business model. Then there's Egypt, where salt found its most bizarre and arguably most glamorous use: mummification. To the Egyptians, salt wasn't only about keeping your fish from smelling, it was about keeping your body from smelling for the next 3,000 years. The magical powder in question was natron, a naturally occurring mix of sodium carbonate and sodium chloride found in dry lake beds. They used it to dry out corpses so thoroughly that you could still high-five some of them today in museums. Without salt, there would be no mummies, just very smelly sandbags that would have had archaeologists holding their noses instead of marveling at their linen wrappings. Salt literally gave the pharaohs eternal shelf life. And because Egyptians never wasted a good resource, salt also slipped into their kitchens and apothecaries. They used it to preserve meat and fish along the Nile, ensuring that their food supply didn't spoil in the relentless desert heat. As for medicine, they applied it in ointments, gargled it for sore throats, and even used it as an early disinfectant. Basically, if you lived in ancient Egypt, salt was your seasoning, your pharmacy, and your funeral plan, all rolled into one handy mineral. The Greeks, never ones to let their neighbors hog the glory, also got in on the salt craze. While they didn't have giant salt deserts at their disposal, they made do with seawater. The process was simple. Leave it in shallow pans, let the sun do the work, and voila, salt. Easy, right? Except for the laborers who spent hours under the Mediterranean sun, sweating buckets while waiting for water to evaporate. At least they didn't have to buy electrolyte drinks. Standing in a salt pan meant you were basically rehydrating just by breathing. And it wasn't just for food. Salt became tied to ritual and economy. The Greeks used it in sacrifices to the gods, proving that even deities were expected to enjoy properly seasoned offerings. After all, who wants bland roast lamb at a divine banquet? Across the ancient world, salt was also traded long before gold and silver made their shiny appearances. Hunters and farmers lugged bags of salt across deserts and valleys to barter with neighbors. You didn't need coins when you had a chunk of seasoning that could keep meat edible through winter. In fact, some of the earliest trade routes likely existed because of salt, long before anyone thought to use them for spices, silk, or luxury goods. Salt was the original hot commodity. But being a salt hunter wasn't easy. Mining salt could be deadly. Digging into underground deposits exposed workers to cave-ins, toxic gases, and the joy of inhaling salty dust all day. It was the ancient equivalent of working in a factory without ventilation, except instead of making gadgets, you were chiseling at what amounted to ancient potato chip dust. The risks were high, but the reward was survival. Entire communities built their lives around these deposits, carving homes, rituals, and economies out of what was essentially edible rock. So picture it, from Mesopotamian marshes to Egyptian deserts, from Chinese bamboo brine pumps to Greek salt pans, early civilizations risked their health, and sometimes their lives for the crystals we casually sprinkle on our popcorn. Salt wasn't just something you passed at the dinner table. It was an anchor for medicine, trade, religion, and survival. In other words, ancient salt hunters weren't just seasoning their food. They were building the foundation of civilization one crystal at a time. And the next time you toss salt over your shoulder for luck, remember, people once staked their lives, their gods, and their eternal afterlife on the same stuff you accidentally spill in the kitchen. If you ever find yourself stuck in traffic on a highway, take comfort in this. At least you're not on a camel trudging across the Sahara with a giant block of salt on your back. For much of history, salt wasn't just something you shook out of a glass bottle. It was so valuable. It demanded its own highways, caravans, and of course tax collectors who never missed a chance to squeeze people for their seasoning. Let's start with the Romans, who basically built roads for everything. Armies, trade, and occasionally for dragging misbehaving citizens into exile. Among their great networks was the Via Salaria salt road, which connected the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River to the heart of Rome. This wasn't a scenic Sunday stroll. This was infrastructure built to ensure the empire never ran out of salty fish sauce or preserved pork. Without Via Salaria, Rome might have had fewer legions and a lot more hangry senators. Salt was so central to Roman life that it wormed its way into their language. The word salary comes from salarium, literally money for salt. Roman soldiers weren't paid exclusively in salt, contrary to the myth, but part of their wages or allowances often went toward purchasing it. Imagine clocking in at work and your boss says, "Here's your paycheck, and by the way, we deducted 3 pinches of salt for office snacks." It's the kind of accounting that makes sense only in an empire fueled by garum, Rome's notoriously pungent fish sauce that required mountains of salt to make. Think ketchup, but smellier. And the Romans poured it on everything. Meanwhile, outside Europe, entire caravan routes in Africa were built around salt. In West Africa, massive slabs of salt were hacked from desert mines like Tagaza and then loaded onto camels. Caravans stretched for miles, each animal carrying a block that weighed more than a modern suitcase packed by someone who doesn't understand airline weight limits. These caravans were so iconic that salt became known as white gold. Towns like Timbuktu and Gaal thrived as crossroads of the salt trade, their markets filled with glittering slabs as valuable as silver. And here's the kicker. In some African kingdoms, salt was literally worth its weight in gold. People would trade 1 pound of salt for 1 pound of gold. Now imagine trying to explain to a medieval trader that, in the future, people would get giant buckets of the stuff for $1 at Walmart. He'd probably pass out on the spot from sheer disbelief. In China, salt routes stretched even further, winding through provinces and mountains. Chinese officials were quick to realize that if you wanted to keep your empire fed and your coffers full, you needed to control the salt. So they created an intricate system of monopolies and trade roads, where salt was produced in certain places and shipped under strict supervision. It was bureaucracy with a dash of seasoning. These salt roads weren't just about moving crystals, they were lifelines for armies and citizens alike. And because the government tightly regulated the trade, salt revenue often made up a massive chunk of imperial income. Forget taxing land, tax the stuff everyone eats. Smart, if slightly evil. Which brings us to the world's most annoying tradition, the salt tax. Nothing stirs rebellion quite like being charged for the privilege of not starving. Governments everywhere realized that if you wanted to make people angry, slap a tax on salt. In France, the infamous gabelle made sure peasants coughed up money for their salt supplies, regardless of whether they needed a pinch or a barrel. Smuggling became rampant. Entire families turned into salt bandits, sneaking contraband crystals across the countryside like it was some medieval narcotic. Picture grandma running a black market operation, except instead of opium, it's seasoning. And people did revolt. Salt taxes were seen as not just burdensome but insulting. Bread without salt tastes like sadness. Charging people for the one thing that made it edible was pushing the limits of human patience. Or as we might put it, imagine working your whole life just to hand over a handful of seasoning to the government. That's not tax, that's insult seasoning. India wasn't spared either. For centuries, rulers and colonizers taxed salt production and distribution, knowing full well that nobody could do without it. Spoiler, this would come back to haunt them much later when Gandhi decided he'd had enough. But let's save that salty protest for another chapter. The beauty and tragedy of salt roads and taxes is that they demonstrate just how deeply embedded salt was in daily life. These weren't just trade routes, they were arteries pumping survival into civilizations. And the taxes weren't just about revenue, they were symbols of control, showing who held power over life's most basic necessity. It's almost absurd to think about. Today, if your government tried to tax salt, people would shrug and buy reduced sodium options. But in the ancient and medieval worlds, salt was oxygen for economies. Without trade routes to bring it in, cities starved. Without taxes to regulate it, rulers went broke. And without it altogether, civilization as we know it wouldn't exist. So the next time you're cruising down a smooth highway, just remember you're following in the footsteps or camel tracks of countless traders who risked deserts, mountains, and grumpy customs officials just to deliver a crystal of salt. And while you may be stuck in rush hour, at least you're not paying a tax collector for the privilege of sprinkling a little seasoning on your fries. War is usually painted as the stuff of epic heroism. Banners waving, swords clashing, generals shouting orders from horseback. But peel back the noble speeches, and sometimes wars were fought for things far less glamorous than freedom or divine destiny. Sometimes men marched to battle and risked their lives for salt. Yes, humans have gone to war over many things: gold, land, religion, but also over the right to sprinkle chips. The reason is simple. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was survival, wealth, and in many cases power itself. Whoever controlled the salt mines and trade routes controlled life and death, not to mention the treasury. And where there's wealth, there's always someone ready to swing a sword for it. Take Italy in the Renaissance, for example, a time when cities weren't just arguing about art and poetry, but also about who had to pay what for their precious salt. In 1540, Pope Paul III imposed a steep salt tax on Perugia, a city in central Italy. Perugia, being full of stubborn people who didn't like the idea of paying extra for their seasoning, revolted. The result was the Salt War of 1540. Now don't imagine epic clashes of thousands. This wasn't the Punic Wars, it was more of a salty family feud. But the principle was deadly serious. Perugia lost, the Pope won, and the city remained under papal authority for centuries, all because no one wanted to pay more for the stuff that makes soup edible. Meanwhile, further north in Poland, the Wieleczka salt mine was practically a kingdom underground. Opened in the 13th century, it became one of the most lucrative enterprises in Europe. The mine stretched for miles, with chambers so vast they resembled cathedrals, complete with chapels carved entirely out of salt. Miners even sculpted salt chandeliers. But behind the artistry was raw economic muscle. The wealth from Wieleczka poured into Poland's coffers, funding armies, palaces and crowns. It wasn't just a mine, it was a bank made of rock crystals. Naturally, this made it a strategic prize fought over and protected with zeal whenever outside forces threatened. If you wanted to weaken Poland, you didn't just burn fields, you went straight for the salt. Then there's Venice, the medieval superpower that turned salty water into pure gold. While other cities worried about farming or defending their walls, Venice looked at the sea and thought, let's monopolize salt. The Venetians built their empire on controlling salt production in the Mediterranean and locking down trade routes. By cornering the market, they forced entire regions to buy from them. That sparkling glass of wine at a Venetian banquet, paid for by some poor farmer inland handing over his last coin for a barrel of salt. Venice didn't just sell salt, they weaponized it. Wars with Genoa, Milan, and other rivals were as much about controlling the flow of salt as they were about trade in silk or spices. In short, Venice wasn't just a city of canals, it was a city built on seasoning. Monopolies like these weren't confined to Italy or Poland. Across Europe and Asia, kings and emperors jealously guarded salt production. They knew that as long as they controlled salt, they controlled their people. No salt meant no preserved meat for winter, no stable armies, no healthy livestock, and no revenue. It was a lever of power as potent as any sword or tax, and like all levers of power, it bred resentment, conflict, and inevitably violence. Some wars were fought not with armies but with blockades. Cut off a city's salt supply, and you starved it into submission without firing a single arrow. It was siege warfare with seasoning. Imagine defending your city walls, not because the enemy is battering the gates, but because you haven't had salted fish in a week and morale is tanking. Soldiers can march hungry, but take away their salt and they're little more than grumpy peasants holding pointy sticks. The global reach of these conflicts is striking. In Africa, rival kingdoms clashed over salt mines in the Sahara. In Asia, dynasties fought to maintain their hold on salt works. Salt wasn't optional. It was a resource you either had or had to steal. And history shows again and again that humans are perfectly willing to draw swords over a seasoning shaker. But perhaps the most absurd part is how invisible these salt wars seem to us today. When we think of causes of war, we imagine epic disputes, ideology, religion, greed. Rarely do we picture kings saying, "Mobilize the army, they're threatening our seasoning." Yet behind many power struggles lurked exactly that. Salt-shaped borders, toppled rulers, and lined treasuries. And while the wars weren't always as bloody or famous as those fought for gold or land, they were no less significant. Salt wars remind us that the mundane can become monumental when survival is on the line. What looks like a condiment to us was once the difference between thriving and starving, between an empire flourishing or crumbling. So the next time you pick up your salt shaker, remember, entire cities bled, kings schemed, and empires rose and fell for the right to do exactly what you're doing. Sprinkle a few grains on your dinner. For most of history, salt wasn't just something you sprinkled on roasted lamb, it was something you sprinkled on your soul. Civilizations saw salt not merely as food or money, but as a substance so powerful it bridged the earthly and the divine. It preserved life, purified corruption, and could even supposedly chase away things that went bump in the night. In short, salt could ward off evil spirits, basically the medieval version of bug spray for demons. Let's begin with Judaism, one of the earliest faiths to give salt a starring role. In the Hebrew Bible, salt was considered a symbol of permanence and divine covenant. Sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem were sprinkled with salt as a sign of purity and incorruptibility. In fact, the covenant of salt was a recurring phrase in Scripture, signifying something that could never decay or fade away. Forget gold or jewels, God's eternal promises were sealed with salt. To this day, Jewish tradition includes dipping bread in salt during Sabbath meals, a subtle reminder that this humble mineral links the dinner table to ancient rituals. Next, turn to Christianity, which inherited a fair share of salty symbolism. Jesus told his followers in the Gospel of Matthew, "You are the salt of the earth," which sounds flattering until you realize he wasn't saying, "Congratulations, you're delicious." He meant they were vital for preservation and integrity, keeping the world from moral rot. Early Christians even used salt in baptisms as a sign of purity and protection, sprinkling it on infants as if to say, "Welcome to the faith, now you're seasoned." By the Middle Ages, salt was a standard tool in Christian rituals. Priests blessed it, scattered it, and mixed it into holy water to keep evil spirits away. You didn't just season your soup with salt, you seasoned your soul. Islam also wove salt into its spiritual fabric. In traditional practice, salt was recommended as the first and last thing eaten in a meal, believed to bring blessing and ward off harm. Some Islamic traditions also speak of salt as a protection against envy and evil forces. In a world where unseen spirits and curses were taken very seriously, a pinch of salt could be the difference between peaceful sleep and a night of unwelcome supernatural visitors. Salt was more than seasoning, it was armor you could eat. But salt's religious role wasn't confined to the Abrahamic faiths. Across cultures it popped up in rituals like an over-enthusiastic guest who refuses to leave the party. In Shinto practices in Japan, salt was used to purify spaces and drive away impurities. Even today, sumo wrestlers scatter handfuls of salt on the ring before a bout, not because they're planning to fry each other, but because it's a symbolic cleansing, pushing away evil and ensuring the fight is pure. In Hindu traditions, salt sometimes appears in purification ceremonies, symbolizing the removal of negative energy. Clearly, whether you lived along the Ganges or the Mediterranean, salt was more than food, it was a spiritual cleanser. Then there are the countless folk beliefs and magical uses of salt. Europeans believed tossing a pinch of salt over your left shoulder could blind the devil lurking there. Why the left? Because that was the side associated with mischief and evil. Accidentally spilled salt was a bad omen, unless you quickly threw some behind you to undo the curse. Basically, if you dropped salt in medieval Europe, you had to perform a whole little dance routine to keep bad luck away. It was superstition mixed with seasoning. Salt also appeared in charms and household magic. In rural Europe, families scattered it at thresholds to keep witches from sneaking in. In Africa, it was sometimes used to cleanse and protect against malevolent spirits. Even sailors carried salt on board as a talisman for safety at sea. Salt wasn't just a condiment, it was a portable force field, one you could keep in a pouch or a cellar. One of the more curious uses was in blessings and oaths. In many cultures, sharing salt with someone created a bond of loyalty or hospitality. To eat a man's salt meant you accepted his protection and gave him your trust. Violating that bond was a serious offense, practically on par with betrayal. Imagine if modern friendships were sealed not with a handshake, but by awkwardly passing a salt shaker across the table. Take this, and now we are bound forever. What's fascinating is how universal salt symbolism was. Despite vast cultural differences, people from Mesopotamia to Mecca, from Jerusalem to Japan, agreed on one thing: salt was sacred. Its ability to preserve against rot and purify against corruption made it a natural symbol for the eternal, the holy, and the protective. Gold may have glittered, but salt was divine. And yet, for all its holy symbolism, salt remained intimately tied to the mundane. It flavored food, cured meat, and treated wounds, even as it was scattered in temples and shrines. It was both holy relic and kitchen staple, proof that the divine could hide in something as ordinary as a pinch of seasoning. So while today we may just flick salt onto French fries, ancient peoples saw in those little crystals the power to purify bodies, bind communities, and protect souls. Salt wasn't just for cooking, it was for covenants, blessings, and warding off evil. In short, it was the one mineral that could sit comfortably in both your stew and your scripture. Picture yourself as a sailor in the 15th century. You've signed up for an adventure across the high seas, dreaming of treasure, new lands, and maybe a parrot that swears at your captain. But before the ship even leaves port, the most important cargo isn't gold coins, cannonballs, or rum. It's salt. Without it, your exciting voyage would quickly devolve into the world's most horrific seafood buffet. Why? Because salt was the only reliable way to keep food edible during months at sea. Refrigerators weren't going to be invented for another 4 centuries. and barrels of fresh fish or meat rotted faster than a sailor's teeth. Salt, however, had the magical ability to preserve food for long stretches of time, meaning sailors could gnaw on something vaguely edible instead of starving. So if you ever feel ungrateful about your slightly soggy sandwich at lunch, imagine having salted beef that had been sitting in a barrel for 5 months. Suddenly, your sandwich doesn't look so bad. The great voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan would have been flat out impossible without salt. Ships left port with barrels upon barrels of salted cod, salted herring, salted pork, salted biscuits. Basically, if you could rub salt on it, it was going on the ship. This wasn't about flavor, it was about preventing mass death. Salted fish in particular became the MVP of seafaring diets. Cod, for example, when salted and dried, could last for years if stored properly. That meant sailors had something vaguely chewable to gnaw on while navigating treacherous oceans. The good news? Salt kept them alive. The bad news? It didn't keep the food tasty. Many records describe ship rations as so tough that sailors had to soak their dinner in seawater just to make it chewable. Nothing says bon appetit like dunking your dinner in the same water you've been throwing your waste into. And of course, salt couldn't save sailors from everything. Yes, it stopped meat and fish from rotting, but it couldn't stop vitamin deficiencies. Salt may have kept food safe, but it didn't stop sailors' teeth from falling out in the grand scurvy epidemic that made every voyage a dental nightmare. Salt kept them alive longer, just long enough for scurvy to finish the job. Truly a double-edged crystal. Salt wasn't just preserving food, it was shaping economies and empires. As European powers expanded into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they weren't just looking for gold and spices. Salt production became a crucial part of colonial infrastructure. The Caribbean, for example, wasn't just sugar plantations and rum. It was also home to massive salt works. Places like the Turks and Caicos Islands became vital suppliers of salt, with laborers raking shallow salt pans under blistering sun. The irony? Many European colonies thrived on both ends of the salt spectrum. On one side, enslaved Africans were forced to labor in deadly salt works, harvesting the very crystals that would preserve food for the sailors and settlers. On the other side, colonists feasted on salted cod imported from Europe, fueling plantation economies that would forever alter the New World. Salt was both the seasoning of survival and the bitter taste of exploitation. Speaking of cod, it deserves its own spotlight. In the age of exploration, salted cod became one of the most traded commodities on Earth. Massive fisheries off Newfoundland provided an endless supply, and the salted fillets were shipped to Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. This triangular trade wasn't just about rum, sugar, and enslaved people. Salted fish was also a key player. Portuguese and Spanish ships carried cod to feed their colonies, while enslaved laborers were often given salted fish as part of their meager rations. The fish was cheap, preserved, and plentiful, making it both a cornerstone of global trade and a reminder of how salt linked together very unequal lives across continents. In a way, cod was the unsung companion of empire, keeping both explorers and exploited workers alive, albeit in very different circumstances. Salt itself also became a product of conquest. Europeans set up salt works in colonies from West Africa to the Americas, sometimes clashing with local traditions that had been producing salt for centuries. In the Caribbean, shallow coastal pans were flooded with seawater, left to evaporate under the tropical sun, and then scraped clean. These salt works were grueling, often deadly. Workers risked blindness, disease, and exhaustion, but the demand was insatiable. Salt shipments fueled exploration, sustained colonists, and became an essential part of maritime trade networks. The same white crystals that once preserved fish in Viking villages were now the invisible engine powering the Spanish galleons and Portuguese caravels of the 16th century. Without it, all those world-changing voyages would have been cut short by the smell of spoiled meat and mutiny. If there's one thing sailors of the age of exploration had in common, it was that they were constantly surrounded by salt in the ocean, in their food, and in their sweat. They were, in a very real sense, marinated men. Salt became synonymous with the sailor's diet, identity, and even slang. To earn your salt meant to prove your worth, and sailors certainly did that by enduring the cruel combination of salted rations, cramped ships, and endless work. Of course, they also discovered ways to make the monotony bearable. A splash of rum here, some creative cooking with biscuits there, maybe even trying to make the salted beef into a stew if the captain wasn't watching. But for the most part their diet was flavorless, tough, and monotonous. Exploration might have sounded romantic, but the reality was chewing your way through rock-hard salted meat while staring at an endless horizon. In the end, salt was the silent partner of every age of exploration success story. It didn't get statues built in its honor, but it probably deserved them. It was the crystal that preserved Columbus's food stores, kept Magellan's sailors chewing through storms, and allowed empires to stretch their reach across oceans. Salt was the invisible ingredient of global expansion, the tiny grain that held back starvation long enough for explorers to redraw the world's maps. Or, put another way, salt didn't just season their food, it seasoned history itself. Salt kept sailors alive, which meant more time for scurvy to make them miserable. If there is one thing people should have learned by now, it's this. Never mess with people's basic seasonings. Bread, tea, salt. These are the small comforts that stand between everyday life and full-scale rebellion. Yet rulers throughout history couldn't resist squeezing every last coin out of salt, and the result was unrest that boiled over into revolutions, independence movements, and the occasional king losing his head. For something that disappears into your stew, salt left a permanent mark on politics. Take France, for example. In the 14th century, the French monarchy introduced the gabelle, a nationwide salt tax, which was as beloved by the French people as spoiled cheese. The tax wasn't just heavy, it was uneven. Some regions paid little to nothing, while others were forced to hand over enormous sums. Worse still, the law required every family to buy a fixed amount of salt every year, whether they needed it or not. Imagine being told you had to buy 5 bags of flour every year, even if you never baked a loaf of bread. People caught smuggling salt across borders could face brutal punishment, which of course only made smuggling more popular. Whole networks of faux sauniers, salt smugglers emerged, sneaking precious contraband from low-tax areas to high-tax ones. The French countryside turned into a cat-and-mouse game between peasants lugging sacks of crystals and royal tax collectors who were basically the hall monitors of seasoning. This tax was so detested that when the French Revolution rolled around in 1789, the gabelle was one of the first institutions people wanted gone. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with royal greed and injustice. When peasants stormed into history demanding liberty, equality, and fraternity, they also wanted the right to sprinkle salt on their food without feeling like criminals. The revolution ultimately abolished the gabelle in 1790, and you can bet that soup tasted a little better that night. Salt taxation troubles weren't confined to Europe. Fast forward a century and a half to colonial India, and the British Empire was making the exact same mistake. The British imposed a salt monopoly, forbidding Indians from producing their own salt and forcing them to buy heavily taxed salt from government sources. It was an audacious policy, telling a country with thousands of miles of coastline that they couldn't evaporate seawater and collect their own crystals. It would be like forbidding people in the desert from gathering sand. Enter Mohandas K. Gandhi. In 1930, Gandhi decided to make salt the centerpiece of his protest against British rule. It was a stroke of genius. Salt wasn't an abstract political issue, it was something every person needed. With his famous Salt March, Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea, where he bent down, scooped up a clump of salty mud and declared it free from British control. That small symbolic act ignited a firestorm. Suddenly, thousands across India joined in, illegally making salt, selling it, and defying the empire. It was a perfect example of how a simple household item could become a weapon of protest. Britain had the army, the guns, and the empire, but Gandhi had seasoning, and he knew how to use it. The impact of the Salt March was enormous. It rallied the masses, humiliated the British on the world stage, and gave ordinary Indians a cause they could quite literally hold in their hands. More importantly, it showed that resistance didn't always have to come through violence. Sometimes, it came in the form of a pinch of crystals between your fingers. That act of defiance helped pave the way for India's eventual independence in 1947. In the end, the empire learned the hard way that trying to monopolize salt was a recipe for losing control of an entire nation. Salt revolts cropped up in other corners of the world too. In Russia, a particularly harsh salt tax in 1648 led to the Moscow Salt Riot, where angry citizens stormed the capital, demanding an end to the unbearable levy. Thousands took to the streets, buildings were burned, and officials were chased out of town. The government backpedaled quickly, realizing that if you're going to raise taxes, maybe don't start with the mineral people rely on to keep their food edible. What ties all these events together is the way salt became a symbol of freedom and dignity. Tax bread, and people grumble. Tax luxury goods and people adjust. But tax salt, and you're messing with the foundation of daily life. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Who owned the right to season food? Who dictated how much salt a family could consume? These weren't small questions. They went to the heart of how much power governments should have over their people. And so, from Paris to Moscow to the Indian coast, salt helped topple unjust systems. The revolts were rarely about salt alone. They were about bigger issues of inequality, oppression, and freedom. But salt was the spark, the everyday injustice that tipped people over the edge. Nothing makes people revolt faster than finding out their soup needs more seasoning, but they can't afford it. In the end, rulers discovered the hard way that you can push your subjects far. But once you start messing with dinner, the guillotine, riots, or mass protests aren't far behind. Salt, once a glittering jewel of power, a cause of war, and the backbone of empires, now lives an unassuming double life. On one hand, it's in every pantry, stacked in cheap plastic shakers, the kind you find buried behind ketchup bottles at diners. On the other, it's quietly doing heavy industrial lifting, melting ice on roads, refining chemicals, and keeping modern life running smoothly. The journey from divine crystal to something you spill on the table and throw over your shoulder for luck is one of history's great demotions, like going from emperor to fast food employee. For most of human existence, salt was rare, costly, and fought over. Today it's so abundant that you can buy a giant bag of it at the supermarket for less than the price of a latte. Industrial mining and modern chemistry have made salt so cheap it barely registers as valuable. The irony is sharp. Empires bled for it, and now most people can't imagine paying more than $1 for the privilege of shaking it over their fries. But salt hasn't disappeared from importance, it's just changed jobs. Take winter, for instance. The same stuff that embalmed Egyptian mummies is now dumped by the ton on icy highways so your car doesn't spin out like a figure skater auditioning for the Olympics. Road salt is big business, and in many snowy countries, entire fleets exist just to scatter it. Without it, commuting in January would be less about getting to work and more about practicing survival skills. Salt also underpins the chemical industry in ways most people don't realize. Sodium and chlorine, the twin elements inside salt, are industrial workhorses. They're used to make plastics, paper, soap, glass, textiles, and countless other everyday products. If you've ever brushed your teeth with toothpaste, turned on a light, or taken a shower, you've indirectly benefited from salt. It's less glamorous than when Roman soldiers were paid in it, but it's arguably more essential now than ever before. And then there's food. Oh, food. Salt's reputation has gone on a roller coaster in the last century. Once celebrated as life-giving, it's now the villain of every health documentary, blamed for everything from high blood pressure to heart disease. Doctors wag their fingers at us like disappointed parents, warning us to put down the shaker unless we want our arteries to form a union and sue for workplace conditions. Yet the truth is a little more nuanced. Salt is essential to life. Without it, your muscles and nerves literally stop working. The problem isn't salt itself, but the modern diet drowning in processed foods where sodium hides like a ninja in bread, sauces and snacks. You're not in danger from the sprinkle you add to your eggs. It's the stealth salt in your instant ramen that's plotting against you. Despite the health debates, salt has embraced its modern role as both kitchen essential and culinary playground. Walk into a trendy food market today and you'll find gourmet salts in every shade and texture. Himalayan pink salt, black lava salt, smoked salt, even flaky sea salt that chefs sprinkle dramatically as if auditioning for a cooking show. Somewhere, a medieval peasant who once paid half a year's wages for a lump of salt is rolling in his grave, muttering, "You're telling me people now buy pink salt lamps?" What makes salt's modern status so fascinating is how invisible it has become. Once tied to revolutions, empires and wars, it's now so mundane that we hardly notice it. You only really think about it when you've run out mid-recipe and have to panic borrow from a neighbor, an act that somehow still carries the awkward intimacy of borrowing sugar. Salt has gone from shaping civilizations to being background noise in daily life, quiet, reliable and unglamorous. And yet, perhaps that's the perfect ending to its story. Salt no longer needs to sit on thrones or spark revolts to prove its importance. Its empire is in the everyday, in the diest road that lets you drive home, in the plastics in your phone, in the seasoning on your dinner. It is everywhere, woven into the fabric of modern living, precisely because it has become so ordinary. So next time you reach for that shaker, remember, you're not just adding flavor, you're holding a crystal that once built nations, toppled kings and kept entire crews of sailors alive across oceans. Salt may no longer be worth its weight in gold, but it's still quietly running the world from the corner of your dining table, right next to the pepper. Before balloons floated gracefully over French vineyards or dangled from the sticky fingers of a 5-year-old at a birthday party, humans were already dabbling in inflatables, though not with rubber, nylon or helium. No, our ancestors reached for something closer to dinner leftovers, animal bladders, stomachs and intestines. Nothing screams innovation quite like looking at a freshly removed pig bladder and thinking, yes, this could be fun. You see, humans have always had two great impulses, survival, and then immediately after, finding ways to entertain themselves. Once the fire was under control and no one was being chased by a wild boar, somebody inevitably started experimenting with the leftover organs. Early civilizations discovered that bladders, elastic, airtight, and importantly, lying around after a feast, could hold air or liquid. The leap from container for water to inflatable plaything was surprisingly short. In fact, records suggest ancient peoples across the globe were toying with inflated organs. The Aztecs, for instance, reportedly used animal bladders as primitive balls in ceremonial games. Imagine an early Mesoamerican version of soccer, except the ball wheezed like an asthmatic goat every time it bounced. In other places, kids may have kicked around pig bladders tied up with string. It was cheaper than carving a ball from wood, and it came with the added bonus of being squishy enough not to break your toes. Bladders weren't just toys, they were also used in ritual and ceremony. In some cultures, inflated organs symbolized life, breath, or the soul itself. Air, after all, was invisible but essential, making it a perfect metaphor for divine forces. Inflate an organ and suddenly you weren't just holding pork leftovers, you were grasping the breath of life. It's hard to say whether participants felt spiritual awe or just tried not to gag at the smell. Ancient China had its own creative twists. Historical records suggest that animal bladders were sometimes inflated and tied together to create flotation devices. Soldiers crossing rivers might strap them on for buoyancy. Picture a weary soldier bobbing across a river with a cluster of squeaky pig bladders tied around his waist. Functional, yes, but not exactly the heroic image we expect from ancient warfare. The idea may have been practical, but it must have looked like the world's saddest pool party. In Europe, inflated bladders had a long tradition as playthings. By the Middle Ages, children were tossing them around in the streets, much as they would later do with leather balls. Shakespeare himself mentioned inflated bladders in his plays, which tells us that bladder games were common enough to be a cultural reference. It's comforting to know that while kings and queens plotted conquests, kids were out back playing kick the bladder, and then there were musical experiments. Believe it or not, bladders were sometimes turned into instruments. A stretched bladder could act as a resonant surface, or be attached to pipes to create odd squeaky sounds. Think of it as the distant, slightly horrifying ancestor of the bagpipe. Nothing says let's celebrate like a piper squeezing air through an organ and producing noises that sound like a goose in distress. But the biggest fascination with early inflatables wasn't just their utility or their entertainment value, it was their strangeness. To inflate something, to give it shape and volume out of nothing but breath, must have seemed like magic. Humans had always struggled to understand the invisible force of air. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it, harness it, and apparently stuff it into animal organs. Inflating a bladder wasn't just a toy. It was an experiment in controlling one of nature's great mysteries. Still, practicality was never far away. Inflated stomachs and intestines could be used to store liquids, or even as floats for fishing nets. Some Native American groups used dried and inflated seal stomachs as containers for oil. Once again, human ingenuity managed to turn yesterday's dinner into tomorrow's water bottle. By the Renaissance, decorated animal bladders were making appearances at fairs and festivals. They might be painted, dyed, or tied up with ribbons. They were cheap, lightweight, and durable enough for a day's amusement. In an era when fun was usually limited to watching someone joust, or trying not to die of plague, batting around a squeaky inflated bladder must have felt downright luxurious. Looking back, it's clear why inflatables fascinated our ancestors. They were cheap, magical, and versatile. They could be toys, tools, symbols, or instruments. And most importantly, they hinted at a bigger dream. What if humans themselves could rise into the air, carried by breath or fire? That leap wouldn't happen until the 18th century, but the seeds were sown every time a child kicked a pig bladder across a muddy street, or a soldier strapped one on to wobble across a river. So yes, before balloons became symbols of joy, science, and the occasional helium-induced squeaky voice, they began as stomachs and bladders, primitive inflatables that made our ancestors laugh, play, and wonder. Humanity's long love affair with balloons didn't start with silk, gas, or rubber. It started with a very brave, or very bored human holding an animal organ and saying, "What if I blew into this?" If the 18th century had a motto, it might have been, "We've lit enough candles, now let's see how many ways we can set the world on fire, preferably with science." It was the age of enlightenment, when reason and curiosity combined with powdered wigs and the occasional risky experiment. Amid this intellectual ferment, two paper-making brothers from Annonay, France, Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier, looked at smoke rising from a fire and thought, what if we put a house in that? Their idea, revolutionary for 1783, wasn't based on complicated physics at first. The Montgolfiers noticed that hot air, or as they thought at the time, a mysterious smoke gas, could lift lightweight objects. Instead of writing this down quietly in a notebook like sensible scientists, they decided to scale up. They began experimenting with enormous linen bags reinforced with paper, tied together in ways that looked halfway between a festival lantern and a giant pillowcase. By trial and error, mostly error, with plenty of singed fabric, the brothers built the first real hot air balloons. Their breakthrough moment came when they staged a demonstration before the townspeople of Annonay. In June 1783, they inflated a massive sack of cloth and paper, and before the astonished eyes of the crowd, the balloon rose majestically into the sky. This was not a little toy bladder tossed about by children in ancient villages. This was a 900-pound contraption soaring like a giant fiery dumpling. The world had just witnessed humanity's first untethered flight, and while the crowd was amazed, you can bet at least one villager muttered, "That's not going to end well." News of the balloon reached Paris, where King Louis XVI and his court were eager to see more. The brothers prepared for their next great act, an experiment before royalty at Versailles. But before they risked sending a human up, they opted for test passengers, a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Imagine the first airline boarding call being a farmyard roundup. The sheep was chosen as a stand-in for humans because sheep were thought to have similar physiology, which says a lot about how 18th century scientists viewed humanity. The duck was selected because birds already flew, so, control variable. And the rooster? He was just there for comparison, a kind of poultry placebo. The basket was loaded, the fire lit, and soon the 3 farm animals were soaring above Versailles, while the king, queen, and a crowd of nobles gawked upward. One can only imagine the duck thinking, "I do this every day, what's the big deal?" The flight lasted about 8 minutes and traveled roughly 2 miles before coming down gently. The animals survived, proving that high-altitude balloon travel was possible without suffocating, combusting, or being smited by the heavens. A scientific milestone had been achieved. The Montgolfiers had brought flight down from the realm of myth and into the smoky, flammable reality of Enlightenment France. Soon after, it was time for humans to take their turn. In November 1783, Pilatre de Rosier, a daring young physics teacher, and the Marquis d'Arlandais, a nobleman who probably had more courage than common sense, became the first human passengers in a free flight. They climbed into a wicker basket beneath the balloon, fueled the fire, and rose above Paris. Imagine looking down on the twisting streets of the city in a time when even rooftop views were rare. They drifted for about 25 minutes, covering 5 miles before landing safely. Paris was electrified. Humanity had left the ground. No wings, no catapult, no mythological help from Daedalus, just hot air and courage. The craze swept Europe. Suddenly, everyone wanted a balloon. Aristocrats commissioned elaborate ascents to entertain crowds. Ballooning became a fashionable spectacle, half science experiment, half carnival act. Artists painted romantic visions of balloons floating above cities, while skeptics muttered that people had finally lost their minds. Governments eyed balloons with suspicion, wondering what kind of mischief could be done with floating spies. But while most observers saw novelty, others recognized potential. The Montgolfier brothers had accidentally opened the door to aviation. Their invention was not just a party trick, it was the beginning of mankind's conquest of the skies. For centuries, humans had dreamed of flight. Now they were living it. One smoky, fire-fueled ascent at a time. And of course, because this was France, the whole endeavor had a flair for drama. Pilots often wore flamboyant outfits to wave at spectators. Balloons were decorated with painted suns, royal emblems, or scenes of myth, transforming each launch into an airborne art installation. There were cheers, there were oohs and ahs, and there was always the risk of fiery disaster. Nothing says Enlightenment science like standing under a giant paper balloon with a bonfire raging beneath it. The Montgolfiers became celebrities, their names forever tied to this age of curiosity and courage. They proved that with enough paper, fabric, and optimism, even the laws of nature could be bent a little. And while their balloons would eventually be surpassed by hydrogen and later airplanes, the moment of their first flights captured something eternal, the thrill of defying gravity with nothing more than ingenuity and audacity. The Enlightenment had produced philosophers, inventors, and revolutionaries, but it also gave us 2 brothers who looked at rising smoke and thought, "Let's make that carry a sheep." It worked, and the skies of Europe were never the same again. The Montgolfiers gave humanity wings, not feathered ones like Icarus, but paper and linen ones, which in hindsight sounds only slightly less dangerous. The first time a soldier was told, "We're going to send you up in a giant floating bag of gas, and you'll just dangle there over the enemy," he probably thought it was a joke. Sadly for him, it wasn't. Long before radar, drones, or satellites, armies turned to balloons as their original eyes in the sky, strapping men to baskets and sending them into the clouds to stare at enemy troop movements. It was brilliant in theory, terrifying in practice, and occasionally hilarious when the giant gas-filled contraptions drifted in entirely the wrong direction. The French were the first to weaponize balloons, not with bombs or fire, but with something far scarier: observation. In 1794, during the French Revolutionary Wars, the Compagnie d'Aérostiers, literally the Balloon Corps, floated above battlefields in hydrogen balloons, peering down on enemy lines like curious gods. Their most famous appearance was at the Battle of Fleurus, where a balloon called l'Entreprenant gave the French commanders updates on Austrian troop movements. Imagine being an Austrian soldier, sword in hand, only to look up and see a wicker basket hanging from the sky with some guy scribbling notes. It's hard to feel heroic when you're basically being spied on by a flying picnic. These floating scouts were not invulnerable, however. Hydrogen, as it turns out, is highly flammable, which meant that one well-placed shot could turn an elegant observation platform into the world's most horrifying fireworks show. Soldiers who went aloft faced the constant risk of musket fire, artillery, or simply drifting too far and landing behind enemy lines, where awkward questions about what exactly are you doing up there were sure to follow. The idea of balloon reconnaissance crossed the Atlantic during the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, who loved new technology almost as much as he loved top hats, supported the creation of the Union Army Balloon Corps under the leadership of Professor Thaddeus Lowe. Lowe was the kind of man who looked at a raging battlefield and thought, "You know what this needs? A balloon." He convinced Lincoln by literally demonstrating from above that he could see all the way to Virginia. Lincoln was impressed, probably because he was used to people saying, "You can't miss it, Mr. President." And here was someone who could actually not miss it. Union balloons were tethered to the ground with ropes and supplied with telegraphs, meaning Lowe could sit in his basket like a Victorian James Bond villain and radio down information in real time. His reports gave Union forces a major advantage, at least when the wind didn't blow him inconveniently over Confederate lines. One Confederate general even complained that Union balloons were making surprise attacks impossible. Though to be fair, a giant floating balloon isn't exactly subtle. It's hard to sneak up on someone when they can literally look up and spot your plans unfolding. The Confederates tried their hand at balloons too, but resources were scarce. Lacking proper silk or gas, they famously cobbled together a balloon from dress silk, stitched together from donations. It was a patchwork wonder, more suited to a parade than a war zone. Nevertheless, they sent it aloft, proving that desperation plus creativity equals airborne fashion statements. Unfortunately for them, Union troops eventually captured it, and the South's balloon dreams deflated both figuratively and literally. Balloons didn't vanish after the 19th century, though. By World War I, observation balloons were a common sight over the trenches. These weren't hot air contraptions anymore, but massive hydrogen-filled giants, tethered by thick cables and manned by unlucky soldiers called balloonists. Their job was to spot artillery targets, track enemy movements, and try not to panic when enemy planes came calling. For a pilot, destroying an enemy observation balloon was like shooting a gigantic floating bullseye. For the men inside, it was like being the bullseye. To defend against these attacks, balloons were guarded by anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes. Some were even equipped with parachutes so observers could leap to safety when the inevitable happened. Still, the psychological toll of hanging over a battlefield in a flammable gas bag while enemy pilots circled below cannot be overstated. Soldiers joked that balloonists had the shortest life expectancy on the front, but also the best views. The irony was that balloons, for all their simplicity, often provided more reliable intelligence than airplanes in those early days. Planes had limited range, shaky cameras, and pilots who sometimes got too distracted by the thrill of dogfighting. Balloons, by contrast, could hover steadily for hours, calmly mapping trenches and spotting enemy artillery flashes. They were less glamorous but incredibly effective. Think of them as the slow, dependable co-worker who gets overlooked while the flashy guy with the sports car, in this case the fighter pilot, hogs all the glory. By the end of World War I, the role of balloons began to fade. Airplanes improved, photography advanced, and soon reconnaissance didn't require hanging in a basket praying that your parachute worked. But the legacy of balloons as military pioneers remained. They had introduced the concept of aerial intelligence, shaped tactics, and reminded the world that sometimes the simplest idea, "what if we just go higher than them," can change the course of battles. It's almost poetic. Balloons, those whimsical symbols of childhood parties, once determined the fate of empires. For the soldiers dangling above the battlefield, though, there was nothing whimsical about it. They were oversized piñatas in the sky, hoping that the enemy didn't have a stick long enough to reach them. By the 19th century, humanity had already mastered the art of filling cloth bags with hot air and terrifying livestock. But there was a problem with hot air balloons. They were at the mercy of every passing gust of wind and couldn't stay aloft for very long. That's when balloonists decided to swap out heated smoke for something far more explosive. Enter hydrogen, a gas lighter than air, easy to produce and catastrophically flammable. In other words, it was the perfect fuel for adventurous Victorians with questionable survival instincts. Hydrogen balloons made their dramatic debut in the late 1700s, not long after the Montgolfier brothers had floated their fire-belching contraption over Paris. Scientists like Jacques Charles saw hydrogen as the next logical step, a gas that required no constant burning of straw and sheep dung, and could theoretically carry people far greater distances. Charles launched the first hydrogen balloon in 1783, just weeks after the Montgolfiers' flight. The crowd went wild, partly with awe and partly with terror, because hydrogen balloons had a nasty tendency to burst into flames if anyone so much as looked at them wrong. Yet danger never stopped anyone from pursuing glamour. Throughout the 19th century, gas ballooning became a fashionable spectacle for Europe's daring elite. These were not simple tethered jaunts above town squares. Pilots began attempting record-breaking journeys, chasing glory, science, and bragging rights. Adventurers crossed the English Channel dangling from wicker baskets, drifted over mountain ranges, and landed in farmers' fields where bewildered peasants mistook them for invaders from the heavens. Gas balloons, for the first time, made long-distance aerial travel possible, albeit with the slight inconvenience that you couldn't steer them. Balloonists simply climbed in, released the ropes, and let the wind decide their destiny. It was less transportation and more polite abduction by the atmosphere. Some balloonists took this to extremes. In the mid-19th century, French daredevil Jean-Pierre Blanchard became notorious for his attempts to cross oceans in hydrogen balloons. His stunts attracted massive crowds, wealthy patrons, and the occasional accident report. Gas balloons weren't just a curiosity, they were now tied to national pride. France and England competed fiercely to outdo each other in balloon achievements, each nation convinced that the heavens themselves were now a geopolitical prize. But hydrogen was not a gas you trifled with. Hydrogen fires were a grim recurring theme in balloon history. Balloons could ignite from static sparks, careless lanterns, or sheer bad luck. Pilots often carried sandbags and barometers, but rarely bothered with fire extinguishers, because honestly, what would you do with one when floating 1,000 feet in the air inside a giant bomb? Stories abound of balloons bursting into flames mid-flight, raining fiery silk, ropes and basket fragments onto terrified onlookers below. Yet these disasters didn't stop the balloon craze. If anything, they added to the drama. The higher the danger, the greater the applause when someone survived. While hydrogen balloons carried the banner of daring exploration, science was along for the ride too. Gas balloons became laboratories in the sky. Meteorologists used them to study weather patterns, sending instruments to altitudes humans could barely tolerate. In 1862, British scientists James Glacier and Henry Coxwell ascended in a hydrogen balloon to over 29,000 feet without oxygen. Glacier nearly blacked out. Coxwell temporarily lost the use of his hands, and the whole venture ended with them barely surviving. But hey, they proved the atmosphere got thinner up there, so science was happy. By the early 20th century, hydrogen had a rival, helium. Discovered in the 19th century but not available in quantity until natural gas fields in the United States were tapped. Helium was everything hydrogen wasn't: non-flammable, safer, and infinitely less dramatic. The problem? America had nearly all of it, and they weren't about to hand it over. The US established a helium monopoly, carefully guarding supplies and banning exports for decades. If you were a European balloonist dreaming of helium-filled safety, you were out of luck. Hydrogen remained the gas of choice across much of the world, despite its tendency to turn balloons into fireballs. This helium monopoly reshaped the entire future of ballooning, and later, airships. Countries that couldn't access helium pressed ahead with hydrogen, leading to spectacular successes and equally spectacular disasters. One might say the 20th century balloon era was less about serene floating in the skies and more about gambling with combustion. Still, glamour persisted. Gas balloons retained a strange allure, equal parts romance and danger. They carried explorers into uncharted territories, inspired artists and writers, and became a recurring symbol of human ambition to rise above earthly limits, regardless of whether physics and chemistry were entirely on board with the plan. And while modern audiences tend to remember the catastrophic hydrogen disasters more than the triumphs, it's worth noting that without this risky chapter, ballooning might never have evolved beyond parlor tricks and county fair rides. In the end, the age of hydrogen and helium was defined by contrast, one gas too dangerous, the other too scarce. Yet both kept humanity dreaming skyward, and if those dreams sometimes ended in fiery explosions or diplomatic squabbles over who got the safe gas, well, no one ever said progress was painless. After all, what is history if not a long list of people doing ridiculous things with dangerous substances in the name of glory? The 19th century was an era when people didn't have TikTok, Netflix, or the option of doom-scrolling themselves into an existential void. Instead, they had something far better, balloons. And not the sagging rubber kind that wheeze out at children's parties. These were massive, fabric leviathans filled with fire, gas, or enough bravado to make even the most cynical townsfolk stop mid-loaf at the bakery and look skyward. Balloons had started life as marvels of science, strange contraptions meant to probe the secrets of the sky. But by the mid-1800s, something shifted. They became entertainment. In other words, humanity invented the balloon festival, part science fair, part circus, and part chaotic beauty pageant where the contestants were giant airborne sacks. In the early decades of ballooning, demonstrations were often staged by scientists or curious inventors who wanted to test altitude, air pressure, or the effects of flight on animals and humans. But people quickly realized that it was even more fun to sell tickets, set up stalls, and invite the entire city to watch someone float into the clouds. A balloon launch wasn't just about science, it was theatre. And like all good theatre, there was suspense. Would the balloon actually rise? Would it catch fire? Would the aeronaut plummet into a haystack? For audiences who had never seen a train, much less an airplane, watching a balloon lift off was like glimpsing a miracle. By the 1820s and 1830s, balloonists were no longer just academics in powdered wigs, they were showmen. Adventurers like Charles Green in Britain or Sophie Blanchard in France turned ballooning into a form of high-wire act. Sophie, for instance, launched balloons at festivals while standing in a tiny chair attached to the rigging, waving at the crowds like royalty who'd taken a wrong turn into the stratosphere. She even set off fireworks mid-flight, which makes today's festival balloonists armed with polite sponsorship logos and GoPros look like amateurs. And Charles Green? He popularized using coal gas instead of hot air, which meant balloons could stay aloft longer. He also flew at night, drifting over London with lamps glowing from the basket, turning the sky into a surreal lantern show. If you were a bored Victorian wandering the streets of foggy London, seeing a floating balloon glowing above the city must have felt like a visit from extraterrestrials. As the 19th century progressed, balloon ascents became the headline act at fairs and public holidays. Local governments or wealthy patrons would fund the spectacle, and the crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, would arrive in their Sunday best. It wasn't just about the balloon, it was a whole carnival atmosphere. You had jugglers, musicians, food stalls, and plenty of vendors ready to sell you overpriced roasted chestnuts while you waited for liftoff. Competitive ballooning soon followed. In 1868, Paris hosted one of the earliest organized balloon races, and soon cities across Europe and America were copying the idea. Nothing stirred up excitement like the idea of two aeronauts competing to drift the farthest. or land in the most unlikely location. Prizes ranged from medals to hefty purses of cash, though the real reward was eternal bragging rights, because nothing says superiority quite like announcing you landed your balloon 200 miles away, narrowly avoiding a farmer's angry pitchfork. It wasn't long before balloonists realized that if you wanted to wow the crowds, size wasn't everything. Color mattered, patterns mattered, and so balloons became canvases, stripes, stars, ornate motifs. Suddenly the skies looked like a medieval tournament had migrated upward. At some festivals, balloons were even crafted to resemble animals or fantastical beasts, ensuring that children would squeal with delight while adults wondered if they'd had too much mulled wine. The technology may have been rudimentary, but the artistry was sublime. A rainbow-colored balloon against a clear blue sky became the 19th century equivalent of fireworks, except it didn't vanish in seconds. It drifted for hours, creating the slowest but most mesmerizing show on Earth. Balloon festivals weren't just entertainment, they were social levelers. Nobles, merchants, farmers and children all gathered together, craning their necks toward the heavens, united in collective awe. For a few hours, nobody cared about class divisions or the price of bread. All eyes were fixed on the giant floating wonder above them. It was a democratization of marvels, a reminder that spectacle could belong to everyone. Some festivals even blurred the line between science and showmanship. Balloonists sometimes released carrier pigeons mid-flight with notes describing weather conditions, or dropped parachutes carrying little trinkets as souvenirs. The combination of genuine discovery and whimsical theatrics ensured balloons maintained a unique status. They weren't merely frivolous toys, nor were they just scientific instruments. They were both. By the early 20th century, balloon festivals had become firmly entrenched in public life. Entire communities planned annual gatherings around ascensions, with balloons serving as the centerpiece. Even as airplanes began to dominate the headlines, balloons retained their cultural cachet. Airplanes promised utility and progress. Balloons promised wonder, and wonder always sells tickets. Though ballooning had begun as a scientific endeavor, by the turn of the 20th century it had transformed into something much more enduring, a ritual of joy. The festivals, with their music, laughter, and drifting giants in the sky, helped define balloons as symbols not just of curiosity but of celebration. They were no longer tools to probe the unknown but companions of human festivity, marking a permanent shift in the story of flight from laboratory to carnival, from charts and measurements to popcorn and applause. In short, the birth of balloon festivals was humanity's way of saying, yes, we could use balloons to study the heavens, but wouldn't it be much more fun to paint them, race them, and sell a few meat pies while we're at it? When we think of balloons today, we don't picture aristocrats launching sheep into the sky, or generals squinting through binoculars while dangling over battlefields. No, we picture something far more humble, colorful, and squeaky: the latex balloon. Those bouncy little spheres of rubber that squeal when you stretch them, pop when you least expect it, and somehow end up tangled in every child's hair at a birthday party. The rise of the latex balloon marks the point in history where balloons stopped being the exclusive toys of kings, scientists, and lunatic adventurers, and instead became a cheap joy for the masses. It was, in short, ballooning's democratic revolution, one rubbery puff at a time. The rubber balloon was born in the early 19th century, and its inventor was none other than Michael Faraday, the same man who gave us groundbreaking work in electromagnetism. In 1824, Faraday wasn't trying to throw a birthday party. He was experimenting with hydrogen gas, a substance known both for its incredible lightness and its charming habit of exploding when you least wanted it to. To trap hydrogen for his experiments, Faraday fashioned little rubber sacks by pressing raw rubber between his hands, cutting them into circles, and sealing the edges. He discovered that these primitive balloons, once inflated, stretched beautifully, showing off rubber's elasticity. The fact that children could one day tie them to sticks and bop their siblings over the head with them probably didn't cross his mind. Faraday, after all, wasn't thinking of party clowns, he was thinking of science. But science has a funny way of turning into fun. Rubber, thanks to its cheap production and flexibility, quickly spread as an industrial wonder material. By the mid-19th century, the process of vulcanization discovered by Charles Goodyear in 1839 made rubber much more durable. No longer was it sticky, smelly, or prone to melting in the summer sun. Suddenly, the balloon could hold its shape longer, survive a little rough play, and even endure the stress of being twisted into animal shapes. If the Montgolfier brothers had lit the flame of balloon fascination, Goodyear had provided the rubber to wrap it in. By the late 19th century, rubber balloons had gone from scientific curiosities to commercial products. They were sold in little packets, marketed as toys for children, and quickly became a household novelty. Unlike the grand hydrogen-filled gas balloons that required entire crews and the risk tolerance of a daredevil, rubber balloons could be inflated with the most humble of gases, your own lungs. This was the great equalizer. No need for wealthy patrons or military budgets. If you had breath to spare and a few pennies in your pocket, you could join in the joy of balloons, and joy they brought. By the early 20th century, balloons were everywhere. They became staples at fairs, carnivals, and celebrations, their bright colors bobbing over crowds like cheerful little planets tethered to Earth by string. Balloon sellers became fixtures of urban life, their hands crowded with bunches of red, blue, green, and yellow globes. In an era before smartphones, a balloon was a child's ticket to instant delight, a toy that was portable, unpredictable, and occasionally startling when it popped. And unlike the rigid kites or fragile dolls, balloons carried the thrill of something alive, something that seemed to breathe and float with you. But balloons didn't just remain toys. Businesses quickly realized that balloons were walking advertisements. By printing their logos on them, companies could hand out colorful billboards that children proudly carried through streets. Suddenly, balloons were part of the great advertising toolkit, floating slogans through city parks and fairs. Banks, bakeries, circuses, and soda companies all took part in the trend. If you wanted to buy customer loyalty in bulk, you didn't need expensive posters. You just needed a helium tank and 1,000 balloons with your name on them. Of course, latex balloons were also perfect for parties. They became synonymous with celebration, whether tied in bunches, scattered across dance floors, or hung in garlands. By the mid-20th century, no birthday seemed complete without balloons hovering around the room. They weren't just decorations, they were the very atmosphere of festivity. And then came the balloon animals, courtesy of clever entertainers who twisted rubber tubes into dogs, giraffes, and hats that squeaked in comic protest with every turn. Balloons had gone from the solemn realm of laboratories and military barracks to the hands of jesters and clowns. The very thing once used for scientific hydrogen experiments was now being turned into poodles for 5-year-olds. Latex balloons also found their place in education and science outreach. Teachers used them to demonstrate elasticity, air pressure, and even combustion, the famous balloon pop experiment, where heat or pin meets rubber. Meanwhile, pranksters discovered their comedic potential. Water balloons became the weapon of mischievous children everywhere, combining the joy of balloons with the chaos of drenching your friends. If nothing else, latex balloons proved they were versatile. They could be toys, tools, teaching aids, advertisements, or weapons of soaking humiliation. There was also a cultural side to the latex balloon revolution. They entered film, art, and even literature as symbols of childhood, freedom, and fleeting happiness. Balloons were impermanent, destined to deflate, drift away, or pop, and that gave them a certain poetic quality. They captured the bittersweet nature of joy, light, colorful, but always temporary. Poets and painters could wax philosophical about balloons, but children mostly just wanted to chase them across the yard. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, latex balloons had fully cemented themselves in daily life. Unlike the dangerous hydrogen airships or the extravagant hot air contraptions, latex balloons were safe, affordable, and delightfully impractical. They had no grand scientific purpose anymore. They were pure fun, pure color, and pure squeak. Humanity had taken a scientific experiment, stripped away the danger, and turned it into the universal symbol of parties, laughter, and joy. The balloon had come down from the clouds and landed firmly in the supermarket aisle. What began as Faraday's little hydrogen-filled pouch had turned into an object that every child expected at their birthday, every parade used in their floats, and every store manager ordered in bulk for grand openings. Balloons were no longer about exploration, they were about expression, and if that meant the occasional ear-splitting pop, so be it. If science gave balloons their wings and festivals gave them their crowd-pleasing spotlight, then pop culture turned them into full-blown celebrities, sometimes adorable, sometimes terrifying, and always larger than life. Few objects have managed to straddle the line between childlike wonder and nightmare fuel quite as successfully as balloons. On one hand, they're whimsical, colorful, and floaty. On the other, they've been the tool of choice for both birthday party magicians and horror movie villains. It's safe to say that balloons have a split personality, and humanity loves them all the more for it. One of the most recognizable balloon-related images in entertainment is the humble balloon animal. The art of twisting latex into poodles, swords, or some vaguely lopsided giraffe has been a staple of circuses, fairs, and children's birthday parties since the early 20th century. While the first rubber balloons were created in the 1800s for scientific purposes, it wasn't until performers realized you could twist them into ridiculous shapes without popping them most of the time that balloon art took off. Clowns quickly adopted the craft, and soon the balloon dog became a staple of Western childhood. Of course, balloon animals walk a fine line, delighting kids while reminding adults that clowns might not be as fun-loving as they appear. After all, nothing says cheerful chaos like a performer inflating a long squeaky tube, twisting it into a dachshund, and then handing it to a child who may or may not immediately pop it in their face. Beyond party tricks, balloons also became essential to one of the grandest traditions in American culture, parades. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, first held in 1924, started as a way for department store employees to show off holiday cheer and, conveniently, remind the public to start Christmas shopping. At first, the parade featured floats, bands, and live animals borrowed from the Central Park Zoo. But in 1927, someone had the genius idea to replace the unpredictable lions and tigers with something equally grand but slightly less bitey: giant balloons. Designed by puppeteer Tony Sarg, the first Macy's balloon characters floated above New York in shapes like Felix the Cat, delighting audiences and creating a tradition that continues nearly a century later. These balloons were, and still are, engineering marvels. Enormous, brightly colored, and tethered by dozens of handlers, they glide between skyscrapers like cheerful airships. Over the years, they've taken on countless forms, from Snoopy to Spider-Man, SpongeBob to Pikachu. Each year, millions of viewers tune in to watch their favorite characters drift through Manhattan, somehow managing to stay inflated despite the city's gusty winds and sharp-edged architecture. The Macy's parade turned balloons into icons of American popular culture, representing joy, spectacle, and the kind of national event where families gather around the TV to shout, "Look, there's Garfield." But while giant balloons can be magical, they've also given us some of the more surreal moments in entertainment history. Balloon mishaps are legendary. Parade balloons have collided with lampposts, gotten tangled in trees, and even injured parade goers. Yet even when disaster strikes, the spectacle only grows. A 50-foot cartoon character, writhing in the wind, is the kind of absurd image that cements balloons firmly into the territory of cultural fascination, equal parts delightful and slightly unsettling. Hollywood, of course, also discovered the balloon's cinematic potential. In films, balloons often symbolize innocence, celebration, or fleeting joy. Think of the 1956 French classic The Red Balloon, a nearly wordless story about a boy and his sentient red balloon companion, tugging at audiences' heartstrings with its bittersweet ending. On the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, balloons have also been weaponized in horror. Stephen King's It made the red balloon a harbinger of doom, forever ruining birthday parties for a generation of readers and moviegoers. The juxtaposition of something as innocent as a balloon with lurking menace shows just how deeply balloons have embedded themselves in our cultural imagination. The circus, the parade, and the silver screen all played their part in elevating balloons from toys to cultural icons. They became shorthand for celebration, whimsy, and sometimes fear. They appeared at weddings, grand openings, sports events, and even protests, floating signs of joy or dissent depending on who held the string. The balloon's versatility as a cultural object lies in its simplicity. It's just air wrapped in latex, yet it can transform into a beloved cartoon, a creepy omen, or a dog-shaped keepsake for a child. By the 20th century, balloons were no longer tied to science labs or serious exploration. They were part of our shared imagination, appearing in art, television, and even music videos. Some artists saw balloons as metaphors for freedom or fragility, while others just appreciated their knack for filling a room with instant festivity. Whether in the hands of a clown making a squeaky giraffe or floating serenely over Manhattan in a Thanksgiving parade, balloons became woven into the very fabric of entertainment culture. What began as scientific experiments with rubber and gas had by this stage morphed into something far more symbolic. Balloons were no longer about reaching the heavens, they were about reaching people's emotions, whether that was laughter, joy, or a sudden unease when a red balloon drifts by unexpectedly. Pop culture embraced their contradictions, cementing balloons as both magical companions and unsettling props. And that dual role is what keeps them endlessly fascinating. By the time we arrive in the present day, balloons are everywhere, from backyards to outer space, and their uses stretch from whimsical fun to serious science. Yet the modern story of balloons is far from a simple celebration. It's a tale of human curiosity, joy, and environmental headaches. But while the balloon has taken its rightful place as a modern marvel of both entertainment and exploration, it has also earned a less flattering reputation as an environmental nuisance, something that once released doesn't politely pop and vanish, but instead lingers in rivers, forests, and oceans, looking less magical by the minute. Take the hot air balloon festivals, for example. If you've ever woken up at dawn and seen dozens or even hundreds of colorful balloons drifting above a field, you'll know why people flock to them. These festivals are the modern descendants of the grand 19th century balloon spectacles, but they've been polished into well-organized tourist attractions. The most famous is the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta in New Mexico, where the sky is transformed into a floating rainbow every October. Thousands of spectators gather for the mass ascensions, when hundreds of balloons lift off at once, creating the kind of scene that makes you briefly forget emails, rent, and climate change. Other festivals take place around the world, from Cappadocia in Turkey, where balloons drift over surreal rock formations that look like nature's attempt at abstract sculpture, to small-town gatherings that turn a quiet weekend into a carnival of color. These events embody the balloon's enduring charm. It is simultaneously ancient in concept, yet fresh in execution, blending human daring with sheer visual delight. But not all balloons today are about tourism and spectacle. High-altitude weather balloons continue to play a crucial role in science. In fact, they are the unsung heroes of modern meteorology. Every day, weather balloons are launched around the globe, quietly carrying instruments called radiosondes that measure temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure as they ascend through the sky. These data points help predict storms, track climate change, and even guide pilots on transcontinental flights. Unlike their flamboyant hot air cousins, weather balloons are designed for function, not looks. They're usually plain and utilitarian, expanding until they reach such high altitudes that they burst and fall back to Earth. Each one is a small but essential part of the invisible machinery that keeps modern life running smoothly, proving that balloons, despite their frivolous reputation, remain vital tools for science. Yet with balloons' modern popularity has come a darker, decidedly unromantic side. Latex and plastic balloons, while delightful in the moment, are notoriously unfriendly to the environment. Unlike their fragile animal bladder ancestors, today's balloons don't vanish with time, but can linger in nature for years. Released balloons, often launched during weddings, memorials, or festivals, can travel great distances before deflating and landing in rivers or oceans, where they pose hazards to wildlife. Sea turtles, for example, mistake deflated balloons for jellyfish, a tragic case of mistaken identity with deadly results. Birds can also become entangled in balloon strings, turning what was once a symbol of joy into an environmental hazard. It's no wonder environmental groups have pushed for balloon release bans in several regions, framing the practice as not whimsical but wasteful. This debate has sparked new innovation, as balloon makers experiment with biodegradable materials or encourage people to think twice before releasing balloons skyward. Alternatives like kites, bubbles, or even drone light shows are increasingly promoted for celebrations, offering the same sense of spectacle without the long-term ecological cost. Still, balloons retain their cultural hold. Few children are as enchanted by a drone as they are by a helium balloon bobbing on a string. The challenge lies in balancing the magic with responsibility, ensuring that future generations can still enjoy balloons without sacrificing environmental well-being. What's most fascinating about balloons today is how they exist simultaneously in multiple worlds: the whimsical realm of clowns, parades and parties, the rigorous world of science and weather prediction, the poetic heights of balloon festivals, and the sobering conversations about sustainability. Few human inventions can claim such a range. They're cheap toys and cutting-edge research tools, romantic symbols of freedom and stubborn reminders of our ecological footprint. And perhaps that's the balloon's enduring trick. It reflects back at us, our contradictions, our ingenuity, and our occasional short-sightedness. In the end, the story of balloons isn't just about air, fabric, or latex. It's about how something so simple, just a container filled with gas, can become a mirror of human dreams, follies, and debates. From ancient bladders to space-bound giants, balloons have lifted humanity both literally and metaphorically. They remind us that wonder is often found in the simplest ideas, but that joy sometimes comes with strings attached, quite literally.